Good evening. Welcome to Sleep Tales, a quiet place for you to unwind and drift away. I am so glad you have decided to join me tonight. Before we begin our story, if you enjoy these tales, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps our little community grow. Please also leave a like on this video, and in the comments below, feel free to share where in the world you are listening from. It is always wonderful to know where these stories are traveling. Now find a comfortable position. Let your body feel heavy and relaxed. Take a slow, deep breath, and let our story begin. The story is about Vera, a quiet and skilled young woman in her early 20s. She works as an apprentice in a small, dusty tailor shop in the port town of Saltwind. The shop is owned by Master Elias, a kind, elderly man who is the only family she has ever known. Vera is technically brilliant. She can sew a perfect seam and follow any pattern with flawless precision. However, she lacks confidence and has no creative voice of her own. She only ever copies Elias's designs, afraid to try anything new. Her life is quiet, safe, and revolves entirely around the predictable rhythm of the shop. Chapter 1. The Silent Needle. The day began in the same way it always did. A sliver of gray light found its way through the small window of Vera's room above the tailor shop. The light touched the wooden floorboards first, then slowly climbed the simple white wall. Vera's eyes opened before the light reached her face. She was used to this quiet waking. There was no need for an alarm clock. Her body knew the rhythm of the shop. It was a rhythm set by the sun and the tide and the steady hands of Master Elias. She lay still for a moment, listening. She heard the distant cry of a gull and the low sigh of the sea. Below her, she heard the gentle creak of the floorboards. That was Elias. He was always awake first. He would be moving through the shop, his soft-soled slippers making a familiar shuffling sound on the wood. He would be opening the shutters, letting the morning air sweep away the dusty scent of the previous day's work. Vera swung her legs out of bed. The floor was cool beneath her feet. She dressed quickly and simply, her fingers moving with practiced ease over the buttons of her plain brown dress. She braided her long, dark hair, tying it back so it would not get in the way of her work. When she was ready, she walked to the door and opened it. The smell of old wood, warm fabric, and brewing tea greeted her. It was the smell of home. She walked down the narrow, winding staircase. The steps groaned under her weight, the same way they did every morning. The shop was bathed in the soft light of the early day. Sunlight streamed through the large front window, illuminating millions of tiny dust motes dancing in the air. These were not motes of dirt, but tiny fibers of wool and cotton and silk, the ghosts of past projects. Bolts of fabric were stacked high on shelves that lined the walls. There were deep blue wools, the color of the midnight sea. There were soft gray linens, the color of a cloudy sky. There were vibrant red silks, the color of a sunset. In the center of the room stood the large cutting table. Its surface was a map of past work, marked with faint chalk lines and countless tiny nicks from the sharp blades of shears. 2 sewing machines sat on smaller tables near the back. They were old and black and made of heavy iron, but they ran as smoothly as the day they were made. Elias took great care of their tools. Vera saw him standing by the window. He was a small, thin man with a cloud of white hair and a kind face full of wrinkles. He held a cup of tea in his hands, watching the town of Saltwind slowly come to life. He turned as he heard her on the stairs and gave her a warm smile. It was a smile that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. He said good morning to her, his voice soft and a little raspy. Vera said good morning back, her own voice quiet. She went to the small stove in the back corner of the shop to pour herself a cup of tea. The routine was always the same. They would drink their tea in the quiet of the morning, watching the world wake up. After their tea, the work would begin. The first sound of the day was always the sharp metallic snip of Elias's shears, cutting through a piece of fabric. It was a clean, decisive sound. It was the sound of a beginning. Vera's first task was usually to heat the heavy irons. She would listen for the hiss of the steam, another part of the shop's morning song. Their work was a silent conversation. Elias would cut the pieces of a garment with an expert hand. He would lay them on Vera's workstation without a word. Vera would then take the pieces and begin to sew. Her hands moved with a quiet efficiency. She would guide the fabric under the needle of her machine, her foot pressing the pedal with a steady rhythm. The hum of the machine was a constant, soothing presence in the room. She could sew a seam so straight and so perfect, it seemed to disappear into the fabric. She could stitch a button so securely, it would never come loose. Her work was flawless. It was a perfect copy of the patterns Elias created. Today, she was working on a simple wool vest for a fisherman. The wool was thick and sturdy, meant to keep out the cold sea wind. She stitched the long seams of the back and the front, her focus absolute. Around mid-morning, Elias came to her workstation. He did not say anything at first. He just watched her hands as she worked. He watched the needle dip and rise, pulling the thread through the heavy wool. When she finished a seam, she looked up at him. He was holding a piece of fabric. It was a beautiful bolt of silk, the color of a clear summer sky. It was soft and light, the opposite of the heavy wool in her hands. He draped it over the corner of her table. He told her he had an idea for a new dress. He described a flowing sleeve, a collar that folded over like the petals of a flower. He was not telling her to make it. He was inviting her. He suggested that she could sketch it out, try a new design. Vera looked at the silk. It was beautiful. She could feel its smoothness just by looking at it. A tiny part of her felt a spark of excitement. She could almost picture the dress he described. But then another feeling came, a feeling that was much stronger. It was fear, the fear of making a mistake, the fear of cutting into that beautiful, perfect fabric and ruining it, the fear of creating something that was not good enough. She looked down at her hands. They knew how to follow a pattern. They knew how to make a perfect seam. They did not know how to create something from nothing. She looked back at Elias and shook her head very gently. She told him it was a lovely idea, but she had the fisherman's vest to finish. She said maybe she would try another time. Elias's smile faded just a little. He nodded, his eyes full of a gentle understanding. He did not push her. He simply folded the blue silk and placed it back on the shelf. Then he went back to his cutting table. The hum of Vera's machine filled the silence. She went back to her work, to the familiar comfort of the straight seams and the thick, forgiving wool. She tried not to think about the blue silk. The rest of the day passed in this quiet rhythm. Customers came and went. A sailor needed a patch on his coat. A merchant's wife wanted a dress hemmed. Vera took their measurements and made the repairs with her usual precision. She was polite and quiet, never making much conversation. The customers trusted her skill. They trusted the work that came from the little shop. In the late afternoon, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Elias started to clean up. He swept the floor, gathering the tiny scraps of fabric and thread. He oiled the sewing machines, his hands moving with a gentle reverence for the tools of his trade. Vera finished the final button on the fisherman's vest. She ironed it one last time, the steam rising in a soft cloud around her. She held it up for inspection. It was perfect, strong, sturdy, and exactly as the pattern dictated. She hung it on the hook for the customer to collect. When the shop was clean and the work was put away, Elias would make them a simple dinner. They ate at a small table in the back of the shop. They did not talk much during their meals. They did not need to. They had spent the whole day in a silent conversation of work and shared space. Tonight, they had soup and fresh bread from the bakery down the street. The soup was warm and comforting. After dinner, Elias would sit in his old armchair and read a book. Vera would sit at the table and work on her mending. Tonight, she was darning a sock. The small, repetitive motion of the needle was calming. It was a good way to end the day. Later, Elias closed his book and said he was tired. He wished her a good night and made his way slowly up the creaking stairs to his room. Vera stayed downstairs a little longer. She finished her mending and put her sewing kit away. She looked around the quiet, sleeping shop. The moonlight streamed through the window now, casting long shadows on the floor. It painted the bolts of fabric in shades of silver and gray. Her eyes found the bolt of blue silk on the shelf. In the moonlight, it seemed to glow with a soft light of its own. She felt a small ache in her chest, a feeling she did not have a name for. It was a mix of longing and fear. She quickly looked away. She put out the single lamp, plunging the shop into darkness. She made her way up the stairs to her own small room. She got into her bed and pulled the covers up to her chin. She listened to the familiar sounds of the old house, the groaning of the wood, the whisper of the wind outside, the faint, rhythmic sound of Elias's soft snoring from the next room. It was the sound of safety. It was the sound of home. Vera closed her eyes. She fell asleep to the steady, comforting rhythm of the world she knew. It was a world that was small and safe, and always the same. The next morning, the sliver of gray light came through the window as it always did. It crept across the floor and up the wall. Vera's eyes opened. She lay still, listening. She heard the distant cry of a gull. She heard the low sigh of the sea. But that was all. She did not hear the gentle creak of the floorboards below. She did not hear the soft, shuffling sound of Elias's slippers. The silence was deep and unfamiliar. It felt heavy. Vera sat up in her bed. Maybe he was just sleeping in. It was possible, but Elias never slept in. She waited. The silence stretched on. It felt wrong. A cold knot of anxiety began to form in her stomach. She got out of bed and dressed, her fingers feeling clumsy. She opened her door and stepped onto the small landing. The air was still and cold. She looked at the closed door to Elias's room. She walked to it and knocked softly. There was no answer. She knocked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. She called his name, her voice small in the big silence. The only reply was the faint whistling of the wind outside the window. She put her hand on the doorknob. It was cold. She turned it slowly and pushed the door open. Elias's room was small and simple. It had a bed, a small wardrobe, and a single chair by the window. The room was neat and tidy, just as he always kept it. Elias was in his bed. He was lying on his back, his hands resting on top of the covers. His eyes were closed. He looked peaceful, as if he were in a deep and gentle sleep. Vera walked to the side of the bed. She whispered his name. He did not move. The knot in her stomach tightened. She reached out her hand, her fingers trembling slightly. She gently touched his shoulder. His skin was cold. It was a deep, still coldness that had nothing to do with the morning air. In that moment she knew he was not sleeping. The rhythm of the shop, the rhythm of her entire life, had stopped. The silence in the room was no longer just silence. It was an absence, a vast, empty space where something important used to be. Vera stood there for a long time, her hand on his cold shoulder. The world outside the window continued to wake up. The sun rose higher, casting a warm, golden light into the room. But inside the room, everything was still and cold. Her grief was not loud. It did not come with tears or cries. It was a quiet, heavy thing that settled over her like a thick blanket. It filled her lungs and made it hard to breathe. The shop below was dark and silent. The shutters were still closed. The tea was not made. The shears were cold on the cutting table. The hum of the sewing machine was gone. There was only silence, a deep, profound silence where the heart of the little shop used to be. Later that day, a man from the town hall came. He was a tall man with a serious face and a stack of papers in his hands. He spoke in a low, respectful voice. He asked Vera some questions, which she answered in a whisper. He made some notes on his papers. Then he told her that he had to read Elias's will. Vera just nodded. She did not really understand what was happening. Everything felt distant, as if she were watching a scene from a play. They sat at the small table in the back of the shop. The man put on a pair of glasses and read from a single sheet of paper. The language was formal and full of words she did not understand. But then she heard her name. The man looked at her over the top of his glasses. He explained in simpler terms. Elias had no other family. He had left everything to her. The shop, the apartment above it, the tools, the bolts of fabric, everything. The man handed her a set of keys. They were the main keys to the shop. They felt heavy and strange in her hand. These were Elias's keys. He had always worn them on a loop on his belt. The man said a few more kind words, then he left. Vera was alone again. She looked at the keys in her palm. They represented a weight, a responsibility that felt immense. It felt impossible. How could she run the shop? She was just the apprentice. She only knew how to follow. She did not know how to lead. The shop was Elias's. His spirit was in the wooden floors, in the worn surface of the cutting table, in the hum of the old machines. Without him, it was just an empty building. As evening fell, Vera did not light the lamps. She sat in the dark shop, a small, still figure in the growing shadows. The moonlight once again streamed through the window, just as it had the night before. But tonight, it did not look beautiful. It looked cold and empty. It illuminated the silent sewing machines and the stacks of fabric that seemed to hold their breath. Her hand reached into the small sewing box that sat on the table. Her fingers closed around a familiar object. It was a simple metal thimble. It had belonged to Elias. It was worn and dented from a lifetime of pushing needles through thick fabric. She had seen him use it 1,000 times. She rolled the small object in her palm. It was still just a piece of metal, but it felt like a connection to him. It felt like the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly dissolved around her. She sat there for hours as the night grew deeper. The town of Saltwind went to sleep. The sounds of the port faded into a distant murmur. The only sound in the shop was the sound of her own quiet breathing. She felt completely and utterly alone. She was the sole owner of a tailor shop, but she had no idea how to be a tailor. She only knew how to be his apprentice, and her master was gone. The needle of her life had lost its thread, and she had no idea how to find it again. Chapter 2. The Cedar Chest. The days that followed were made of silence. Vera tried to run the shop, but the life had gone out of it. Each morning she would wake to the deep quiet, and the cold knot of anxiety would return to her stomach. She would walk down the stairs into the shop, and the emptiness would greet her like a physical thing. She would force herself to perform the morning rituals. She would open the shutters, but the morning light seemed weaker now, less cheerful. It illuminated the same dancing dust motes, but now they seemed sad, like lost souls. She would sweep the floor, but the sound of the broom was lonely and loud in the empty space. She made tea, but it tasted bland. She would sit at the small table in the back and drink it alone, staring at the empty chair where Elias always sat. The chair was just a piece of furniture, just wood and fabric, but it held the shape of his absence. She could not bring herself to move it. She could not bring herself to sit in it. So it remained, a quiet monument to the silence that had taken over her life. She would turn the sign on the door from closed to open. It felt like a lie. The shop was not truly open. Its heart was closed. Customers would trickle in during the day. Their faces were full of sympathy. They would offer her their condolences, their voices soft and sad. Vera would nod and thank them, her own voice a near whisper. They would bring her their mending, a torn seam on a shirt, a missing button on a coat, a frayed hem on a dress. These were jobs she could do. These were jobs that required precision, not creativity. They were tasks of following a line, of repairing what was already there. She would take the garments and promise to have them ready in a day or two. Her hands would work with their old skill. She would stitch a seam so perfectly that the repair was invisible. She would sew a button so it was stronger than the original. But her work brought her no satisfaction. It was just a mechanical motion, a way to pass the hours. One afternoon, a wealthy merchant's wife came into the shop. She was a regular customer of Elias's. She wanted a new dress for an upcoming celebration. She brought with her a bolt of beautiful green velvet. She began to describe the dress she wanted, talking about a fashionable new style she had seen. Vera listened, her hands growing cold. The merchant's wife asked her if she could make it. Vera looked at the velvet. It was rich and dark, like moss in a deep forest. The thought of taking shears to it, of cutting into its perfect surface, filled her with a wave of panic. She could see Elias in her mind, his hands moving with confidence, sketching a design, making the first bold cut. She could not do it. The fear was a wall in front of her. She told the woman that she was very sorry, but she was not taking on new commissions right now. She was only doing repairs and alterations for the time being. The woman's face fell with disappointment. She looked around the quiet shop, at the empty cutting table, and her expression softened with pity. She said she understood. She gathered her expensive fabric and left the shop. Vera watched her go, a feeling of deep shame washing over her. She was a tailor who was afraid of fabric. She was the owner of a shop she did not know how to run. She felt like an imposter, playing a part in a play where she had forgotten all her lines. The evenings were the longest. After she closed the shop, the silence would deepen. She would eat a small, lonely meal of bread and cheese. The food had no taste. The world outside the shop window would grow dark. The sounds of salt wind would fade. The lamplighter would pass, leaving pools of golden light on the cobblestone street. Vera would sit in the growing darkness, the thimble Elias had used still in her pocket. She would roll it between her fingers, the cool metal a small, familiar comfort. She would look at the tools of her trade, the shears, the needles, the spools of thread. They looked like artifacts from another life. They were Elias's tools. They were waiting for a master's hand, and hers was the hand of a timid apprentice. She would go to bed early, but sleep did not come easily. She would lie in the darkness and listen to the sounds of the old building. The creaks and groans that had once been comforting now sounded mournful. The absence of his soft snoring from the next room made the silence feel even louder. She was alone in the house for the first time in her life. The weight of that aloneness was crushing. She was adrift in a small, quiet boat with no sail and no rudder. After a week of this suffocating routine, something inside her began to shift. The grief was still there, a constant, heavy ache. But another feeling started to grow alongside it. It was a restless energy, a desperate need to do something, anything, other than sit and wait for the day to end. She could not bear the sight of the silent shop any longer. She needed a task, a project that would occupy her hands and her mind. Her eyes fell upon the narrow door at the back of the shop, behind the main cutting table. It was the door to Elias's private workroom. He had rarely let her in there. It was his sanctuary, the place where he designed his patterns and worked on his most special projects. It had been left untouched since his death. A thick layer of dust was beginning to settle on everything. The thought of cleaning it, of putting it in order, felt like a purpose. It felt like a way to be close to him, to touch the things he had touched, to inhabit his world one last time. It was a task she could manage. It did not require creativity. It only required work. The next morning, after her tasteless tea, she did not open the shop. She left the sign on the door turned to closed. She walked to the back of the shop and stood before the workroom door. She put her hand on the cool metal knob and turned it. The door opened with a low creak. The air that came out of the room was still and thick with the scent of old wood, paper, and a faint, sweet smell of pipe tobacco that was uniquely Elias. The room was small, even smaller than she remembered. It was crowded with the history of a long and dedicated life. A single window, grimy with dust, let in a weak, hazy light. Rolled up paper patterns were stacked in tall piles in one corner. Some were yellowed with age, others were crisp and new. Sketches of coats, dresses, and trousers were pinned to a large corkboard on one wall. The drawings were quick and energetic, full of life. It was a side of Elias she rarely saw, the spark of creation before the careful work of measuring and cutting began. A small workbench stood against the far wall. It was covered in specialized tools she had only seen him use a few times. There were strange curved needles for working with leather, heavy pinking shears for finishing seams, and small, delicate instruments for fine embroidery. Spools of thread in every color imaginable were arranged on a high shelf. There were threads of pure silk that shone like jewels, and threads of strong linen, and soft wools spun so fine they were like a spider's web. Books were piled on another small table. They were not the storybooks he read in his armchair. These were heavy, serious books about the history of fashion, the geometry of pattern making, and the art of tailoring. Vera stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply taking it all in. This was the heart of his craft. This was the place where his ideas were born. A wave of sadness washed over her. She felt like an intruder in a sacred space, but the feeling was quickly replaced by her newfound resolve. She was not here to intrude. She was here to care for his legacy. She was here to put things in order. She went back into the shop and returned with a bucket of warm water, a soft cloth, and a broom. She started with the window. As she washed away the layers of grime, more light began to stream into the room. It was like pulling back a curtain. The light illuminated the dust that covered every surface. She began to clean, slowly and methodically. She started at the top of the room, wiping down the high shelf of threads. She took each spool down, wiped it clean, and then wiped the shelf before placing it back. Her hands moved with care and reverence. Each spool held a memory. She remembered the gold thread he had used for a wedding dress. She remembered the dark blue thread he had used for a sea captain's coat. Next, she moved to the corkboard. She gently took down each sketch, wiping the dust from its surface before pinning it back up. She saw the evolution of his ideas in the drawings. A simple collar would be drawn again and again, each time with a small change, until it was perfect. She saw his patience, his dedication to getting every detail right. She spent the entire morning cleaning. She swept the floor, gathering piles of dust and tiny fabric scraps. She wiped down his workbench, carefully cleaning each tool before setting it back in its place. The work was hard and dirty, but it was also peaceful. The repetitive motions calmed her mind. With each surface she cleaned, it felt as though she were clearing a little of the fog in her own head. She was not just cleaning a room. She was tending to her memories of him. She was processing her grief through the simple physical act of work. As she worked, she talked to him in her head. She told him about the merchant's wife and the green velvet. She told him how scared she was. She imagined his kind face, the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners. She imagined he would tell her not to be afraid. He would tell her to just make the first cut. The work took her into the afternoon. She forgot about lunch. She was lost in her task. Finally, the room was clean. The light filled the space, reflecting off the polished wood of the workbench and the shining metal of the tools. The room was no longer a dusty tomb. It was a workspace waiting for a tailor. As she was finishing, her broom hit something solid under the workbench. She knelt down to see what it was. Tucked away in the darkest corner, covered by a thick, dusty canvas sheet, was a large wooden chest. She had never seen it before. It was made of a dark, reddish wood and bound with black iron hinges. It had a large, heavy lock on the front. She pulled the canvas sheet off, sending a cloud of dust into the air. She ran her hand over the top of the chest. The wood was smooth and cool. It smelled faintly of cedar. Curiosity, a feeling she had not felt in a long time, began to stir inside her. What was in this chest? Why had he kept it hidden? She tried to lift the lid, but it was locked tight. She looked at the lock. It was old and strong. She would need a key. She stood up and scanned the room. Where would Elias keep a key? He was a man of habit and order. He did not like clutter. The key would be somewhere safe, somewhere logical. She checked the small drawers of the workbench. She found only buttons, buckles, and spare needles. She checked the pockets of an old work coat hanging on a hook. They were empty. She ran her hands along the tops of the shelves, feeling for a key hidden on a ledge. She found nothing but more dust. She felt a pang of frustration. She sat down on the small stool by the workbench, feeling defeated. Her eyes scanned the room again, this time more slowly. She looked at the piles of books on the table. Elias loved his books. He treated them with great care. His favorite book was not a tailoring manual. It was a small, thin volume of sea poems he would read in the evenings. She remembered seeing it on his bedside table the morning she found him. She had brought it downstairs and placed it on the mantelpiece in the shop. She stood up and walked out of the workroom, back into the main shop. The book was there, right where she had left it. It was a simple book with a worn blue cover. The title was printed in faded gold letters. She picked it up. It felt light in her hands. She held it by its spine and shook it gently. A small, dark object fell out from between the pages and landed on the floor with a soft clink. It was a key. It was made of old iron, with a simple rounded top. It was small, but it looked strong. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She picked up the key and went back into the workroom. She knelt in front of the cedar chest. With a trembling hand, she inserted the key into the heavy lock. It was a perfect fit. She turned the key. There was a loud, satisfying click as the lock opened. She took a deep breath. She lifted the heavy lid of the chest. The air that rose to meet her was rich and wonderful. It was the deep, clean scent of cedar wood, a smell that spoke of preservation and care. The inside of the chest was lined with smooth, dark fabric, and resting inside, folded with perfect precision, was a magnificent cloak. Vera had never seen anything like it. It was made of a wool so dark it was almost black, the color of a stormy sea at night. The fabric was heavy and dense, yet it felt incredibly soft to the touch. She lifted it carefully from the chest. The weight of it surprised her. This was a garment made for travel, for facing the wind and the rain. The cut was simple and elegant, but there was a boldness to it that was not like Elias's usual conservative style. The shoulders were strong, and the cloak was long, designed to fall almost to the ankle. She unfolded it, and the true surprise was revealed. The lining was made of a deep blue silk, the color of twilight. It was covered in the most intricate, beautiful embroidery she had ever seen. The stitches were tiny and perfect. They formed a swirling pattern that looked like the currents of the ocean. It was breathtaking. But as she looked closer, she saw that it was not finished. The embroidery on the lining was complete, but the main body of the cloak was plain. The collar and the cuffs were unadorned. It felt like a story that had stopped just before the final chapter. It was a masterpiece, but it was an incomplete masterpiece. Beneath where the cloak had been lying, there was a small leather satchel. It was made of thick, worn leather that was stiff with age. A simple brass buckle held it closed. Vera's fingers fumbled slightly as she unfastened the buckle. Her curiosity was now a burning fire. This was a secret life, a secret project that Elias had hidden from everyone, even from her. She opened the flap of the satchel. Inside, there were 3 items. The first was a rolled-up piece of paper tied with a thin leather cord. She untied the cord and carefully unrolled the paper. It was a map. It was not a printed map, but one that had been drawn by hand in dark ink. It showed a stretch of coastline with detailed drawings of cliffs and bays. A single island was drawn just off the coast. It was circled in the same dark ink. Beside the circle, a name was written in Elias's familiar, neat handwriting. The name was the Isle of Skye. The second item was a small, leather-bound book. It was a journal. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was Elias's, but it looked different. It was the writing of a younger man, more hurried and less steady. She read the first entry. It was not about tailoring. It was about the smell of salt in the air and the sound of waves crashing on rocks. It spoke of a deep longing for a home he had left behind. She flipped through the pages. The journal was full of these kinds of entries. They were poems and thoughts about the sea, about a rugged, windswept land. A picture of a man began to form in her mind that was completely different from the quiet, gentle master she had known. The third and final item in the satchel was a single piece of paper, folded into a small square. She unfolded it carefully. There were only a few lines written on it, in the same neat hand as the name on the map. The note was about the cloak. It read, "The work is nearly done. It has waited for so long, but it cannot be finished without the final, most important part. It needs a thread spun from the sea's own light, found only on the Isle of Skye. Vera read the words again and again. A thread spun from the sea's own light. It sounded like something from a fairy tale. But the cloak in her hands was real. The map was real. The journal was real. Everything suddenly clicked into place. The unfinished cloak, the map of the Isle of Skye, the journal full of longing for the sea. This was Elias's final project. It was a journey he had planned to take, a journey home, a journey he never got to make. Vera sat on the floor of the dusty workroom, the magnificent cloak spread out beside her, the map, the journal, and the note in her lap. The afternoon light slanted through the newly clean window, illuminating the objects in her hands. Her mind was reeling. This was a side of Elias she had never known. He was not just a tailor from Saltwind. He had come from somewhere else. He had a past, a secret history that he had kept locked away in this cedar chest, and he had left it for her to find. A choice appeared before her, as clear as two paths in a forest. One path was to fold the cloak and put it back in the chest. She could put the map, the journal, and the note back in the satchel. She could lock the chest and push it back under the workbench. She could pretend she had never found it. She could go back to her safe, quiet, unhappy life. She could continue to open the shop each day and do simple repairs. She could live in the shadow of her fear, slowly fading like a piece of fabric left too long in the sun. The other path was terrifying. It led out of the shop, out of the town of Saltwind, and into the unknown. It was the path of finishing his work. It was the path of closing the shop, of risking the little security she had. It was the path of taking this strange map and trying to find a mythical thread on a remote island. It was a foolish, irresponsible idea. It was an adventure, and she was not an adventurous person. She stayed there on the floor for hours as the light in the workroom faded. Her mind was a battleground. Her fear told her to stay. It told her she was not strong enough, not brave enough. It reminded her that she was just a quiet apprentice, not a traveler. Her grief told her to stay. It told her to cling to the familiarity of the shop, the last place where she had felt his presence. But another voice, a small, quiet voice she had not heard in a long time, whispered for her to go. It was the voice of curiosity, the voice of longing. What was this thread spun from the sea's own light? Who was this young man in the journal? What would it feel like to finish this incredible cloak, to put the final stitch in his life's secret masterpiece? To go felt like a betrayal of the safe life he had given her. But to stay felt like a betrayal of his final wish. The debate raged inside her through the evening and into the night. She did not eat. She did not sleep. She just sat with the remnants of his secret life. The next day, she tried to work. She took a simple mending job, a tear in a child's dress. But her hands felt clumsy. Her mind was not on the needle and thread. It was on the map and the cloak. She kept looking at the door of the workroom, knowing what was inside. She felt trapped. The shop, which had once been her entire world, now felt like a cage. In the afternoon, her eyes fell upon the bolt of blue silk on the shelf. It was the fabric Elias had shown her, the one he had wanted her to use for a new design. She remembered his face, the small, gentle smile that had faded when she said no. She remembered the look of faint disappointment in his eyes. He had wanted her to be more than a copy. He had wanted her to create, and she had been too afraid. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the shop window. She saw a pale, tired face. She saw a young woman who was afraid of fabric, afraid of ideas, afraid of living. She realized that staying in Saltwind, in this quiet, grieving shop, was not honoring Elias. It was a continuation of her own fear. The greatest honor she could pay him was to do the one thing he had always encouraged her to do: be brave. The fear of leaving was immense, but suddenly the fear of staying was greater. The fear of becoming a ghost in her own life, a silent keeper of a dying shop, was the most terrifying thought of all. A quiet resolve settled over her. It was not a burst of courage. It was a calm, steady certainty. She knew what she had to do. She walked back into the workroom. The cloak was still lying on the floor where she had left it. She knelt down and touched the soft, dark wool. It no longer felt like just a garment. It felt like a promise. She carefully folded it, the blue silk lining whispering as it moved. She placed it back inside the cedar chest, but she did not lock it. She would need it for her journey. She took the leather satchel with the map and the journal and the note, and she held it in her hands. Her decision was made. She did not know where the Isle of Skye was. She did not know if a thread spun from the sea's own light was real. She only knew that she had to go and find out, for Elias and for herself. Chapter 3: The Ocean's Seam. The decision, once made, settled in Vera's heart like a smooth, heavy stone. It was solid and real. It did not banish her fear, but it gave her a direction to walk, a compass point in the swirling fog of her grief and uncertainty. The days of aimless silence were over. Now, her days were filled with a quiet, focused purpose. She had a journey to prepare for, and this preparation became a new kind of work, a new rhythm to replace the one she had lost. The first task was the most difficult. She had to close the shop, not just for the day, but for an unknown length of time. The thought of it made her stomach clench. The shop was her home, her shield. Leaving it felt like shedding her own skin, but she knew she had to. She could not take it with her. She found a piece of clean white card. With a steady hand, she took a piece of charcoal and wrote a simple message. She did not write that she was going on an adventure. She did not mention the cloak or the island. She simply wrote, "Closed for a time. I will be back soon." She pinned the sign to the inside of the front door, the letters facing out to the street. It was a small, simple act, but it felt monumental. It was a promise to the town and a promise to herself. I will be back soon. Next, she had to pack. She had never traveled before. Her entire life had been contained within the walls of the shop and the few familiar streets of Saltwind. She did not know what a person needed for a journey. She stood in the middle of her small room, feeling overwhelmed. She looked at her few possessions, plain dresses, sturdy shoes, her sewing kit. She decided to start with what she knew best. She laid her sewing kit on her bed. It was a small leather roll that contained her most essential tools, sharp needles of different sizes, a silver thimble, her own, not Elias's, small, sharp scissors for snipping thread, a block of beeswax for strengthening her thread. She added a few extra spools of strong black and white thread. Her tools were her comfort. They were an extension of her hands. Whatever happened on this journey, she would have her craft with her. Then she thought about the cloak. It was the reason for this entire journey. She went to the workroom and took it from the cedar chest. It was too beautiful and too important to be packed away in a bag. She decided she would wear it. It was heavy, but it felt right. It felt like she was carrying Elias's purpose with her. The cloak would be her protection against the unknown. She chose her sturdiest dress and her most comfortable shoes. She packed one spare dress, a few pairs of socks, and a warm woolen shawl. She did not have many clothes. Her life did not require a large wardrobe. She then went to the small kitchen area in the back of the shop. She packed some hard cheese, a loaf of bread, and a small bag of dried apples. It was not much, but it would last for a few days. She filled a small water skin. Finally, she gathered the most important items: the leather satchel containing the map, Elias's journal, and the cryptic note. She put the satchel inside a larger, sturdier canvas bag. She added her small bundle of clothes and food. The bag was not heavy. Her entire worldly existence was surprisingly light. The last thing she did was count her money. Elias had left her a small amount of savings, tucked away in a tin box. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to live on for a few months if she was careful. She took most of it with her, leaving a small portion hidden in the shop. She looked around the quiet, sleeping shop one last time. The bolts of fabric on the shelves looked like silent witnesses. The sewing machine stood like patient sentinels. She whispered a quiet goodbye to the room, to the ghosts of her past life. Then, with the heavy cloak on her shoulders and the canvas bag in her hand, she walked to the front door, turned the key in the lock, and stepped outside. The morning air of Saltwind was cool and damp. It carried the familiar smells of salt, fish, and wet stone. Vera had lived with these smells her entire life, but today they smelled different. They smelled of a beginning and an end. The town was just starting to wake up. A baker was sweeping the steps of his shop. A few sleepy fishermen were walking towards the docks. No one paid her much attention. She was just a quiet girl in a dark cloak, a familiar shadow in the town's morning routine. But inside, she felt like a completely different person. Every step she took away from the shop was a step into a new, unknown world. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She walked through the winding cobblestone streets. Her destination, the one part of Saltwind she had always avoided. The docks. The docks were the town's noisy, chaotic heart. She had always found them intimidating. The few times she had gone there with Elias to deliver a finished garment to a sailor, she had stayed close to his side, overwhelmed by the shouting, the smells, and the sheer number of people. It was a place of constant motion, of arrivals and departures. It was the edge of her world, the place where the solid ground of salt wind met the vast, unknowable sea. As she got closer, the sounds grew louder. The cry of the gulls became a constant, raucous clamor. She could hear the rhythmic creaking of wooden ships straining against their ropes. She heard the shouts of sailors calling to each other in languages she did not understand. The smell of the sea grew stronger, mixed with the smell of tar, diesel fuel, and frying fish from the dockside food stalls. She emerged from the narrow streets onto the main wharf. The scene before her was a dizzying whirlwind of activity. Ships of all sizes were moored along the wooden docks. There were small, nimble fishing boats with their nets piled high. There were larger, sturdier merchant vessels, their decks crowded with barrels and crates. Men with weathered faces and strong arms were everywhere, loading and unloading cargo, coiling thick ropes and mending sails. The air was thick with energy. It was a world of men, a world of hard work and loud voices. Vera felt small and invisible in her dark cloak. She pulled it tighter around herself, her canvas bag held tight against her chest. She did not know what to do. She did not know how to find a ship, how to ask for passage. Her fear was a cold hand gripping her throat. She almost turned around. She could go back to the shop, unlock the door, and pretend this had all been a foolish dream. She took a deep breath of the salty air. She thought of the unfinished cloak. She thought of Elias's sad, secret journal. She could not go back. She forced her feet to move forward. She walked along the edge of the wharf, her eyes scanning the names painted on the bows of the ships. The names were romantic and strange. The North Star, the Serpent's Kiss, the Lucky Penny. She had no idea which one to choose. She looked at her hand-drawn map. It showed the coastline, but it did not show shipping routes. It gave her a direction, north, but no clear path. She realized she would have to ask someone. The thought terrified her. She was not good at talking to strangers. She looked at the faces of the sailors. They were rough and busy. They would have no time for a quiet girl with a strange question. She walked for what felt like a long time, a silent observer on the edge of this chaotic world. She was about to give up hope when she saw a smaller ship tucked away at the end of a quieter pier. It was not as grand as the big merchant vessels, but it looked clean and well cared for. Its wood was dark and oiled, and its brass fittings gleamed in the morning sun. The name painted on its bow was simple and gentle: the Sea Foam. A man was on the deck, coiling a rope with practiced, efficient movements. He was older than the other sailors she had seen, with a kind, weathered face and a thick gray beard. He looked less intimidating than the others. He looked like a man who might listen. Vera took another deep breath and walked down the pier towards the ship. The wooden planks creaked under her feet. As she got closer, the man on the deck looked up. He stopped his work and watched her approach, his eyes curious. She stopped at the edge of the pier, just beside the ship. She had to look up to see him. She clutched the strap of her bag, her knuckles white. She found her voice, but it came out as a small, hesitant whisper. She asked him if he was the captain. The man's expression softened. He gave her a small, kind smile. He said that he was. He had a deep, calm voice, like the rumbling of a distant wave. Vera held out her map. Her hand was trembling. She asked him if he was heading north, along the coast. She pointed to the island she had circled. The captain leaned over the railing to get a better look at the map. He squinted at the hand-drawn lines. He nodded slowly. He said they were a merchant ship carrying wool and timber to the northern towns. He said their route would take them past that very island. He asked her what a young woman like her was doing with a hand-drawn map of the Northern Isles. Vera did not know how to answer. She could not tell him the truth. It sounded like madness. She simply said that she had to deliver a message. It was a half-truth. The cloak was a message of a sort. The captain looked at her for a long moment. He looked at her simple, clean dress, her serious face, and the heavy, well-made cloak she wore. He seemed to be weighing something in his mind. Then he nodded again. He told her they did not usually take passengers, but he said she looked like she was not looking for trouble. He told her the price for passage. It was a significant portion of her savings, but it was a fair price. Vera agreed immediately, a wave of relief washing over her. The captain told her they would be leaving with the afternoon tide. He told her she could come aboard now if she liked. He lowered a small wooden gangplank from the ship to the pier. It looked narrow and unsteady. Vera hesitated for a moment, then she took the first step. The plank swayed slightly under her weight. She held her breath and took another step, and then another, until her feet were on the solid wood of the ship's deck. She had done it. She was on her way. The captain introduced himself as Reese. He showed her to a small space below deck where she could store her bag. It was not a cabin, just a small, cramped area near the cargo hold. It was dark and smelled of wool, wood, and the ever-present scent of the sea. But it was a space for her. She was grateful. She spent the next few hours sitting on the deck, out of the way of the crew, just watching and listening. She saw another sailor come aboard. He was much younger than Captain Reese. He had a friendly, open face and a shock of sandy-colored hair that was constantly falling into his eyes. He moved with a quick, cheerful energy, his bare feet sure on the wooden deck. He seemed to be doing a dozen jobs at once, checking ropes, securing barrels, and talking to the captain. He noticed Vera sitting in the corner and gave her a quick, curious smile before going back to his work. The activity on the docks slowly began to wind down. The loading was finished. The hatches to the cargo hold were closed and secured. The sun was high in the sky now, warming the wooden deck. Vera could feel the gentle rocking of the ship, even though it was still tied to the pier. It was a constant, soothing motion. Finally, Captain Reese gave the order to cast off. The young sailor untied the thick ropes that held the ship to the pier and tossed them onto the deck. Another sailor on the pier tossed the last rope aboard. The ship was free. A large sail was unfurled. It was a beautiful sight. The canvas billowed out, catching the wind with a loud snap. The ship began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. It slid away from the pier, away from the familiar world of the docks. Vera stood near the railing, her hands gripping the cool wood. She watched the town of Saltwind begin to shrink behind her. She saw the bustling wharf, the jumble of rooftops, the tall, thin spire of the town hall. She saw the small, familiar shape of the tailor shop, its window looking like a dark, empty eye. A pang of sadness and fear shot through her. She was leaving everything she had ever known. But as the ship moved further out into the open water, a new feeling began to emerge. It was a feeling of lightness. The weight of the silent shop, the heavy blanket of her grief, seemed to be lifting just a little. The open sea stretched out before her, a vast expanse of glittering blue-green water. The sky above was immense and clear. The world was so much bigger than she had ever imagined. The first few days at sea were a blur of new sensations. The constant motion of the ship was the most difficult thing to get used to. The deck was never still. It rose and fell with the swell of the waves, a slow, relentless rhythm that her body did not understand. In the beginning, a constant feeling of sickness churned in her stomach. She could not eat. She spent most of her time sitting on the deck, her face pale, staring at the unchanging line of the horizon. The young sailor she had seen earlier was named Finn. He seemed to notice her quiet misery. On the second day, he brought her a cup of weak, warm tea. He told her it would help her stomach. He had a kind, easy smile. Vera thanked him, her voice barely a whisper. He sat with her for a few minutes, telling her that everyone felt this way at first. He said the sea takes some getting used to. He told her to keep her eyes on the horizon, not on the moving deck. He said her body would learn the rhythm soon enough. He was right. Slowly, very slowly, her body began to adjust. The sickness in her stomach began to fade. She was able to eat a little of the simple food the crew ate: hard biscuits, salted fish, and dried fruit. Finn became a quiet, friendly presence in her new life. He did not ask her a lot of questions. He seemed to understand that she was a private person. Instead, he would simply share parts of his own world with her. He would point out the different types of seabirds that followed the ship, calling them by name. He showed her how to tie a few simple, useful knots. In the evenings, after his work was done, he would sometimes sit near her on the deck. He would tell her simple stories about the stars. He would point out the constellations, giving them their sailors' names: the serpent, the anchor, the ship. He told her how sailors had used these stars to find their way across the dark, empty ocean for thousands of years. Vera was a quiet listener. She did not say much, but she absorbed everything. His stories were like a bridge to this strange new world of the sea. They made it feel a little less intimidating, a little more understandable. She began to feel a small, tentative sense of peace. The rhythm of the ship became her new rhythm. She would wake with the sun, the same as she always had. But now, she woke to the sound of the wind in the sails and the creaking of the ship's timbers. She would spend her days on the deck, wrapped in Elias's cloak, watching the endless parade of waves. The sea was never the same. It changed color with the changing light, from a pale, misty gray in the morning to a brilliant, sparkling blue at midday, to a deep, inky black at night. The nights were the most profound. After the sun had set in a blaze of orange and purple, the world would shrink to the small wooden deck of the sea foam, adrift in an ocean of darkness. The only light came from a single lantern hung on the mast and the brilliant, cold light of the stars. The sky at sea was unlike any sky she had ever seen. There were no town lights to dim their glow. There were millions of them. A thick river of silver dust spilled across the black velvet of the night. It was on these long, quiet nights that Vera finally opened Elias's journal. She would find a sheltered spot on the deck, out of the wind, and read by the faint light of the ship's lantern. The journal was not a record of his daily life as a tailor. It was something much more personal. It was the voice of a young man she had never known. The entries were not dated with years, only with seasons. They were full of a deep, aching love for a place he had been forced to leave. He wrote about the wind, a wild, constant presence that shaped the land and the people. He wrote about the sheep, with their thick, oily wool that smelled of the sea. He wrote about the taste of salt on his lips after a storm. He wrote about his family, a stern father, a quiet mother, and a younger sister he had adored. His words painted a picture of a life that was hard and simple, but also beautiful and deep. As she read, she began to understand. The quiet, gentle tailor she had known was only half of the man. The other half was this young man, full of a fierce love for his rugged home. He had left the Isle of Skye as a boy, full of dreams of the wider world. He had come to Saltwind and built a new life, a successful life. But he had never forgotten the place he came from. The longing for it was a current that ran deep beneath the calm surface of his life. Vera realized that the magnificent cloak was not just a piece of tailoring. It was a bridge. It was his attempt to connect the two halves of his life. It combined the sophisticated skills he had learned in the town with the materials and the spirit of his island home. It was his way of finally going back, of making peace with the boy he had been and the man he had become. Reading the journal was a sad and beautiful experience. She felt closer to him now than she ever had when he was alive. She was not just following his final instruction. She was completing his life's story. The journey was no longer just about a strange thread. It was about understanding the man who had been her only family. It was about bringing a piece of him home. The vastness of the ocean, which had at first been so terrifying, now began to feel different. It felt like a space for thought, a space for healing. The endless horizon was a clean, straight seam, stitching together the sky and the water. The rhythmic rise and fall of the ship was like a slow, steady breath. For the first time since Elias's death, Vera felt like she could breathe again. She was still sad, she was still afraid, but she was no longer lost. She had a map in her hand and a purpose in her heart, and the great wide ocean was carrying her forward. Chapter 4: The Isle of Skye. The journey on the sea foam settled into a gentle, predictable pattern. The days were marked by the sun's slow arc across the sky, and the nights were measured by the steady turning of the stars. Vera's body had finally learned the rhythm of the sea. The ship's constant rolling motion no longer made her sick. It felt as natural as breathing. She spent her time in quiet observation, a silent figure in her dark cloak, watching the crew as they went about their work. They were men of few words, their hands speaking a language of ropes and sails that she was slowly beginning to understand. Finn remained her only real connection to the human world on the ship. He would seek her out during his moments of rest, his friendly presence a small anchor in her sea of solitude. He never pressed her for details about her journey. He seemed to accept her simple explanation that she was delivering a message, asking no more. Instead, he shared his own world with her. He pointed out pods of dolphins that would sometimes race alongside the ship, their sleek bodies leaping from the waves in joyful arcs. He showed her the subtle changes in the water's color that signaled they were passing over deep trenches or shallow banks. He taught her the names of the clouds and what they foretold about the weather. Through his eyes, the vast, empty ocean became a place of subtle signs and hidden life. One morning, the air changed. It grew colder, sharper. The soft, hazy quality of the southern coast was replaced by a crisp clarity that made the distant horizon seem closer, sharper. The color of the sea shifted from a friendly blue-green to a deeper, more serious shade of gray. Captain Reese told her they were entering the northern waters. He said they would reach the Isle of Skye by the next day. A nervous energy began to flutter in Vera's chest. The island, which had been just a name on a map, a destination in a dream, was about to become real. She spent the rest of the day at the ship's railing, her eyes scanning the horizon, searching for the first sign of land. As the afternoon sun began to dip low, Finn pointed to a faint, dark line in the distance. It was barely visible, a smudge of charcoal against the pale gray sky. He told her that was it, the Isle of Skye. As the ship sailed closer, the smudge grew into a solid shape. It was not the gentle, rolling land she had half expected. The island rose from the sea in a series of dramatic, jagged cliffs. It looked like a fortress, a piece of land that had fought a long battle with the relentless sea. The cliffs were dark and imposing, streaked with the white of countless seabirds. There were no trees, only a rugged, windswept landscape covered in a blanket of low green and brown vegetation. It was a stark and beautiful place, but it was not welcoming. It was wild and untamed, a land that did not seem to care for the comforts of people. The sea foam did not dock at a large harbor. There was no bustling wharf like the one in Saltwind. Captain Reese skillfully navigated the ship into a small, sheltered cove, protected from the open sea by two great arms of rock. A simple wooden pier extended from a small beach of dark gray sand. On the beach, a handful of small, sturdy fishing boats were pulled up above the high tide line. Beyond the beach, nestled in a shallow valley, was a small cluster of stone buildings. This was the island's only village. It was tiny. Vera could count the number of houses on her two hands. They were low, solid structures made of the same dark gray stone as the cliffs. Their roofs were thick with turf, a living green against the gray stone. Wisps of smoke rose from a few of the chimneys, the only sign of life. There were no shops with bright signs, no paved streets, no grand buildings. It was a place stripped down to its essentials: shelter, warmth, community. Captain Reese told her this was as far as he could take her. He said they would be anchored here for a day to trade some goods with the villagers before continuing their journey north. He told her he would be returning south in about a month's time and could offer her passage back if she was still here. Vera thanked him, the words feeling small and inadequate for the kindness he had shown her. Finn helped her with her bag. He walked with her down the gangplank and onto the solid ground of the pier. After weeks at sea, the land felt strangely still beneath her feet. It felt dead and unmoving compared to the living, breathing deck of the ship. Finn did not leave her at the pier. He walked with her along the sandy beach towards the village. The air was cold and smelled of salt, seaweed, and the damp, earthy scent of the turf roofs. The sound of the waves crashing on the beach was a constant low roar. It was a much more powerful sound than the gentle lapping of the water in Saltwind's protected harbor. Finn asked her where she was going. Vera admitted that she did not know. She told him she was looking for someone, a weaver, who could help her with her task. Finn nodded, his expression serious. He told her that in a village this small, everyone knew everyone. He said the person she was looking for would likely be the elder. He walked with her to the first of the stone houses. He said a quiet word of goodbye and wished her luck. He told her to look for the sea foam if she needed anything before they left. Then he turned and walked back towards the ship, his sandy hair bright against the gray landscape. Vera watched him go, a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness hitting her. He had been her one friend in this new world. Now she was truly on her own. She stood for a moment, gathering her courage. The village was quiet. There was no one on the single muddy path that ran between the houses. The only movement was the wind, which tugged at her cloak and pulled strands of hair from her braid. She took a deep breath and walked up to the door of the nearest house. She knocked. The sound was loud in the quiet air. After a long moment, the door opened a crack. A woman's face appeared in the opening. She had a weathered face and suspicious eyes. Vera asked her if she knew where she could find a weaver. The woman just stared at her for a moment, her eyes taking in Vera's town clothes, the fine wool of her cloak, her pale, soft hands. The woman did not say a word. She simply pointed a rough finger towards a small house at the far end of the village, then closed the door. The message was clear. She was not welcome. Vera walked through the village, feeling the weight of unseen eyes watching her from the windows of the small houses. The suspicion was a tangible thing, as thick as the sea mist that was beginning to roll in. She felt like a different species, a creature from another, softer world. The house at the end of the village was just like the others, small and made of stone, but it had a small, well-tended garden beside it, full of hardy-looking vegetables. This small patch of order in the wild landscape gave her a sliver of hope. She knocked on the door of this house. This time, the door opened all the way. An old woman stood in the doorway. She was small and wiry, her body bent by age, but still full of a tough, resilient strength. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, carved by a lifetime of wind and sun. Her hair was pure white, pulled back in a tight, severe bun. Her eyes were the most startling feature. They were a pale, piercing blue, the color of the sky on a cold winter's day. They looked at Vera with an intelligence and a severity that made Vera feel as if the old woman could see right through her. This had to be the person she was looking for. Vera found her voice and asked the question that had brought her all this way. She asked the old woman if she knew anything about a thread spun from the sea's own light. The old woman's expression did not change. Her pale blue eyes narrowed slightly. She looked Vera up and down, her gaze lingering on the fine, dark wool of Elias's cloak. There was a long, heavy silence, broken only by the sound of the wind. Vera's heart pounded in her chest. She had come so far. Everything depended on this moment, on this woman's answer. Finally, the old woman spoke. Her voice was low and raspy, like the sound of stones grinding together. She did not answer Vera's question. Instead, she asked a question of her own. She asked Vera what an outsider, a soft-handed town girl, wanted with their thread. Her tone was not curious. It was accusatory. The suspicion Vera had felt from the other villager was 10 times stronger in this woman. Vera was taken aback by the hostility. She tried to explain. She told the woman that her master, a great tailor, had passed away. She said he had left behind an unfinished project, a beautiful cloak. She explained that his final note had instructed her to come here, to find this special thread, to complete it. As she spoke, she unfastened the cloak from her shoulders. She wanted to show the woman the beautiful embroidery, the fine craftsmanship. She held it out, an offering, a piece of evidence for her story. The old woman's eyes flickered to the cloak. She looked at the dark wool, the intricate stitching on the silk lining. For a brief second, Vera thought she saw a flicker of something else in the woman's eyes, a flash of recognition, of pain. But it was gone as quickly as it came. The woman's face hardened again into a stony mask. She looked from the cloak back to Vera's face. She told Vera that their thread was not a trinket for sale. It was not for outsiders. It was part of their life, their history. It was earned, not bought. Her words were like small, sharp stones. Vera's hope began to crumble. She felt a wave of despair. She had come all this way, risked everything, for nothing. The woman was going to send her away. She was about to turn, to walk away in defeat, when the old woman spoke again. She said that if Vera wanted to understand the thread, she could not just be told about it. She had to understand the life it came from. She had to understand the work. The woman's pale blue eyes held a challenge. She told Vera she could stay, but she would not be a guest. She would work. She would earn her keep. And then maybe she would be shown what she came to see. It was not the welcome Vera had hoped for, but it was not a refusal. It was a chance. Vera nodded her head, her throat too tight to speak. She accepted the offer. The old woman stared at her for another long moment, as if trying to gauge the depth of her resolve. Then she gave a short, sharp nod. She told Vera her name was Sorsha. She did not ask for Vera's name. She pointed to a tiny stone hut, barely more than a shed, that stood a short distance from her own house. She told Vera she could stay there. Then, without another word, Sorsha turned and went back into her house, closing the door firmly behind her. Vera was left standing alone in the cold, misty air. She looked at the small hut Sorsha had indicated. It was a bleak and lonely-looking place. She walked towards it, her beautiful, heavy cloak feeling absurdly out of place in this rugged Spartan world. The hut was tiny. The inside was bare stone walls, a dirt floor, and a low wooden platform covered with a pile of rough, scratchy blankets that would serve as a bed. There was no window, only a small opening high in the wall that let in a sliver of gray light. The air inside was cold and damp. This was to be her new home. Vera sat down on the edge of the hard bed. The reality of her situation crashed down on her. She was on a remote, unfriendly island, at the mercy of a stern old woman who seemed to despise her. Her ship was leaving the next day. She was completely cut off from everything she had ever known. A wave of fear and regret washed over her, so powerful it almost made her physically sick. What had she done? This was madness. She should have stayed in Saltwind. She should have locked the cedar chest and never opened it. She buried her face in her hands. The rough wool of Elias's cloak was soft against her skin. She breathed in its faint, familiar scent of cedar and old thread. It was a small comfort, a tiny link to her old life. She thought of his journal, of the young man who had loved this wild, hard place. She had come here to understand him. She could not give up now. She had to see this through. She had to earn the thread. She lay down on the rough blankets, pulling the cloak over her like a shield. She closed her eyes and listened to the constant, mournful cry of the wind and the relentless roar of the sea. It was the sound of her new life, and it was the sound of a great and difficult test beginning. The next morning, Vera woke to the cold. It was a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to come from the stone walls and the damp earth floor. Her body ached from the hard bed. She sat up, wrapping the cloak tighter around herself. The small opening in the wall showed a sliver of gray, misty sky. She did not know what time it was. There was no town clock here, no familiar rhythm to the day. She stood up and stretched her stiff limbs. She knew she had to go to Sorcha's house. Her test was beginning. She walked out of the hut and into the cold morning air. The sea mist was so thick she could barely see the houses at the other end of the village. The world was a swirl of gray and white. She knocked on Sorcha's door. It opened immediately, as if the old woman had been waiting for her. Sorcha was dressed in simple, practical clothes of hand-spun wool. She held a wooden bucket in her hand. She did not say good morning. She simply thrust the bucket into Vera's hands and told her to fetch water from the well. She pointed vaguely into the mist. The well was on the other side of the village. Vera took the heavy bucket and set off. The path was muddy and slippery. The mist was disorienting. She felt her way through the gray silence, her town shoes quickly becoming soaked and caked with mud. She found the well, a simple stone circle with a rope and a bucket. She lowered the bucket into the darkness. It came up full of icy, clear water. The bucket was incredibly heavy. She struggled to lift it from the well. She had to use all her strength to haul it back through the village, her arms straining, the cold water sloshing over the sides and soaking the front of her dress. By the time she got back to Sorcha's house, her back ached and her hands were numb with cold. She had spilled almost a quarter of the water. Sorcha looked at the half-empty bucket, then at Vera's wet dress and muddy shoes. She did not say anything. She just took the bucket and closed the door. That was the beginning of her new life. Every day was a series of hard, menial tasks. Sorcia did not teach her anything. She simply gave her orders. Vera had to learn to herd the island's sheep. They were not like the placid, fluffy sheep of the mainland. They were tough, agile animals with thick, shaggy wool and intelligent, wary eyes. They would scatter at her approach, leading her on long, frustrating chases over the rocky, uneven hillsides. She spent hours out in the wind and the rain, her clothes constantly damp, her hair a tangled mess. Her job was to keep them together and protect them from the steep cliffs. She fell countless times, her hands and knees becoming a collection of scrapes and bruises. At the end of the day, she would be exhausted, her muscles screaming in protest. She had to help mend the stone walls that crisscrossed the island, protecting the small patches of garden from the fierce wind. The work was back-breaking. She had to lift heavy, awkward stones, her soft tailor's hands quickly becoming raw and blistered. She had to learn to fit the stones together like a puzzle, a skill that required a strength and a logic that she did not possess. Her walls were clumsy and uneven compared to the neat, sturdy walls built by the islanders. But she kept working, stone by heavy stone. She had to dig for peat, the island's fuel source. She would go with the other women to the boggy land in the center of the island. They would use special spades to cut the wet, heavy earth into bricks. Vera's bricks were misshapen and crumbly. The other women worked with a silent, practiced efficiency, their movements economical and strong. They mostly ignored Vera, their faces closed and suspicious. She was the outsider, the weak link. Her fine town clothes were quickly ruined. The delicate fabric of her dresses tore on the sharp rocks. The hems were constantly caked in mud. Her comfortable shoes fell apart from the constant dampness and the rough terrain. One of the village women gave her a set of old, cast-off clothes. They were made of the same rough, hand-spun wool that everyone on the island wore. The fabric was scratchy against her skin, and the clothes were shapeless and unflattering. But they were warm and strong. They were the uniform of her new life. Her hands suffered the most. The soft, nimble fingers that could guide a needle with perfect precision became rough, red, and calloused. Her fingernails were broken and permanently rimmed with dirt. She would look at them in the evenings, these new, ugly hands, and feel a sense of despair. They were no longer a tailor's hands. She felt as if she was losing the one part of herself that she was proud of. But she did not complain. She did not cry. She simply did the work. She would wake up in the cold darkness of her hut, her body aching, and she would force herself to get up and face the day. She did every task Sorcia gave her, no matter how difficult or demeaning. She did it with a quiet, stubborn persistence. She was determined to prove herself. She was determined to earn the right to finish Elias's cloak. The evenings were the only time she had to herself. She would return to her cold, damp hut, her body weary to the bone. She would eat the simple meal that Sorcia left for her, usually a piece of dry bread and a bowl of thin fish soup. It was bland, but it was warm, and she was too hungry to care. After she ate, she would take out Elias's journal. It was her only comfort, her only link to the person she used to be. She would read his words by the light of a single, smoky tallow candle. And as she read, a strange thing began to happen. The words on the page began to merge with her own daily experiences. He wrote of the biting wind that left your face feeling raw. She knew that wind. She felt it every day. He wrote of the earthy, damp smell of the peat bog. She knew that smell. It clung to her clothes and her hair. He wrote about the stubborn intelligence of the island sheep. She knew that stubbornness all too well. She was not just reading his words anymore. She was living them. She was walking the same paths he had walked, feeling the same wind on her skin, doing the same work. A new understanding of him began to form in her mind. The boy who had run away from this place had not been running away from something ugly. He had been running away from something hard. He had been young and had craved a softer, easier life. She began to understand his longing, and she also began to understand his regret. This hard, wild place had a beauty and a strength that was undeniable. It shaped the people who lived here, making them as tough and resilient as the land itself. Slowly, very slowly, things began to change. Her body grew stronger. The work was still hard, but her muscles no longer screamed in protest. She learned the rhythms of the island. She learned to read the sky for signs of rain. She learned the paths the sheep were most likely to take. Her hands hardened, the calluses protecting them from the rough stones and the wet wool. She was still clumsy, still an outsider, but she was no longer completely useless. The villagers began to notice her quiet persistence. Their open hostility softened into a grudging respect. They still did not speak to her much, but their stares were no longer full of suspicion. One evening, as she was returning from the hills with the sheep, a woman offered her a cup of hot herbal tea. It was a small gesture, but it felt enormous. It was a crack in the wall of her isolation. Another day, a young boy, no older than 10, came to her. He had a large, clumsy tear in the sleeve of his woolen coat. He held it out to her, his expression shy. He had seen her in the evenings, mending her own rough clothes with neat, invisible stitches. He asked if she could fix his coat. Vera took the coat. The wool was thick and oily. She went back to her hut and took out her small sewing kit. Her fingers, which had grown so rough and clumsy with the heavy work of the island, felt awkward at first as they held the small, delicate needle. But as she began to sew, the old, familiar rhythm came back to her. Her hands remembered their true purpose. She did not just mend the tear. She reinforced the seam, making it stronger than it was before. Her stitches were tiny and perfect, a line of perfect order in the rough hand-spun fabric. She returned the coat to the boy the next morning. He looked at the repair in amazement. The tear was gone, replaced by a seam so neat it was almost invisible. He gave her a wide, grateful smile. Sorcia saw it all. The stern old woman missed nothing. She saw Vera's growing strength. She saw the other villagers begin to accept her. She saw the perfectly mended coat. That evening, when Vera returned to her hut, she found a small, hand-carved wooden stool waiting for her inside. It was a simple, humble object, but it was a gift. It meant she no longer had to sit on the cold, damp floor. It was a sign. The next day, Sorcia did not send Vera to the hills with the sheep or to the peat bog. She told Vera to come inside her house. Vera had never been inside before. It was small and dark, but it was warm and clean. A fire glowed in the hearth. The air smelled of wood smoke, drying herbs and wool. In the center of the room, there was a large loom, and beside it, a simple spinning wheel. Sorcha looked at Vera, her pale blue eyes holding the same intensity they had on the first day. But now, there was something else in them. A flicker of interest, a glimmer of respect. She had not said that Vera had passed her test. She had not said that she would teach her about the thread. But Vera knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the real work, the work she had come here to do, was about to begin. Chapter 5. Earning the Thread. The invitation into Sorcha's house was a silent turning point. The door did not just lead into a warm, dry room. It led into the heart of the island's craft, into the world Vera had only glimpsed from the outside. The weeks of hard, physical labor had been a test, a long and arduous trial designed to break her spirit or strip away her softness. Vera had not broken. She had endured. She had bent to the will of the island, and in doing so, she had found a new and unfamiliar strength within herself. Now, a new kind of work was to begin. It was a work of the hands, but a different kind of work. It was a craft that required not just strength, but patience, focus, and a deep, intuitive understanding. Sorcha did not praise her. She did not offer a word of welcome. She simply pointed to a low stool near the hearth. Vera sat, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight. The warmth from the fire was a luxury she had not felt in weeks. It seeped into her bones, easing the constant ache in her muscles. She watched as Sorcha moved around the small room with a quiet, purposeful energy. The old woman's movements were economical and precise, honed by a lifetime of practice. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. Sorcha did not begin by teaching Vera how to spin. The lesson started at a much more fundamental stage. She handed Vera a large, greasy fleece, freshly shorn from one of the island's sheep. It was heavy and smelled strongly of lanolin, salt, and the damp earth. It was a raw, wild thing, full of burrs, dirt, and small pieces of dried vegetation. Sorcha's instruction was simple: clean it. She provided Vera with 2 large wooden tubs of water. One was filled with near-boiling water from a kettle on the fire, the other with cold water from the well. The process was slow and methodical. Vera had to submerge sections of the dirty fleece in the hot water, using a wooden stick to swish it around, loosening the dirt and the excess grease. Then, she had to transfer the heavy, dripping wool to the cold water to rinse it. The work was wet and messy. The hot water burned her hands, and the cold water made them ache. But Vera worked without complaint. She remembered her first days on the island, her revulsion at the dirt and the hard labor. Now, she simply saw it as part of a process. She was transforming something raw into something usable. She spent the entire day washing the fleece, changing the water again and again until it ran clear. By the end of the day, the pile of greasy, dirty wool had been transformed into a cloud of soft, clean fibers, drying on a rack near the fire. It was still not white. It had a creamy, natural color, and it still smelled faintly of the sheep and the sea. Her hands were red and sore, but she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. She had taken the first step. The next day, the lesson continued. Sorcia brought out 2 flat, wooden paddles with wire teeth like wide, stiff brushes. These were the carders. She took a handful of the clean, dry wool and, with a few deft movements, began to brush it between the 2 carders. Her hands moved in a steady, rhythmic motion. The tangled, clumpy fibers were teased apart, straightened, and aligned. The result was a light, airy roll of wool called a rowlog, where all the fibers were lying in the same direction, ready for spinning. Sorcia handed the carders to Vera. Vera tried to imitate the old woman's movements. Her own hands felt clumsy and slow. She either brushed too hard, creating a tangled mess, or too softly, failing to align the fibers. Her rowlogs were lumpy and uneven. Sorcia would watch her, her expression unreadable. She would not correct Vera with words. She would simply take the carders from her hands and, in a few silent, perfect motions, demonstrate the technique again. Then, she would hand them back. It was a frustrating process. Vera's tailor's hands, so skilled with a needle and fine thread, were inept at this rough foundational work. But she persisted. Day after day, she sat by the fire, carding wool. She filled basket after basket with her clumsy, lumpy rowlags. She did not throw them away. She simply set them aside and started again. Slowly, very slowly, her hands began to learn the rhythm. Her movements became smoother, more confident. She learned to feel the wool, to sense how much pressure to apply, how to tease the fibers apart without breaking them. Her rowlogs began to look less like lumpy caterpillars and more like the light, airy clouds that Sorcia produced. All this time, the islanders' attitude towards her continued to soften. They had seen her working with the sheep and the stones. Now they saw her through the small window of Sorcia's house, sitting by the fire, learning their oldest craft. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful curiosity. The children were the first to fully accept her. They were drawn to her quiet nature and the magic her hands could perform with a simple needle and thread. They would bring her their small treasures, a bird's feather, a smooth sea stone, a torn doll. Vera would mend their toys with a care and precision the island had never seen. She never spoke much, but her gentle actions communicated a kindness that they understood. One afternoon, the young boy whose coat she had mended came to Sorcia's door. He was holding out a small, roughly carved wooden bird. It was a clumsy, charming object, but it was made with care. He gave it to Vera as a gift. It was the first gift she had received since Elias had passed away. She held the small bird in her rough, calloused hand, and a wave of warmth spread through her chest. It was a small, simple act of friendship, and it meant the world to her. She continued to read Elias's journal at night, in the quiet of her small stone hut. The little wooden bird sat on the ledge beside her candle. The journal entries from his youth spoke of the long winter evenings, of the sound of the loom and the spinning wheel, the constant, rhythmic heart of the home. He wrote about his mother, a quiet woman whose hands were never still. He described watching her spin, the thread seeming to appear from her fingers as if by magic. He wrote about the stories the old women would tell as they worked, stories of the sea, of ancient magic, and of the island's history. Vera realized she was not just learning a craft. She was stepping into the pages of his journal. She was living the life he had left behind. This realization gave her a new sense of purpose. She was not just here for herself to finish a cloak. She was here for him to reconnect the threads of his severed past. She was closing a circle that had been left open for a lifetime. One afternoon, a small crisis struck the village. A fierce, unseasonable storm had blown a fishing boat against the rocks, tearing a large hole in its sail. The sail was made of heavy, thick canvas, and mending it was a difficult job. The men of the village were skilled at making rough, strong patches, but the tier was in a critical place. A clumsy repair would not hold against the force of the wind. One of the fishermen, the father of the boy whose coat Vera had mended, came to Sorcia's house. He spoke to Sorcia in a low, worried voice. He explained the problem. He knew that Vera was a tailor from the town. He asked if she could help. Sorcia looked at Vera. It was another test. Vera did not hesitate. She nodded. She followed the fisherman down to the beach. The damaged sail had been spread out in a large, sheltered shed. It was a huge piece of fabric, smelling strongly of salt and fish. The tier was long and jagged. The men stood around, their faces grim. A lost sail in this season meant lost time on the water, lost income for the family. Vera walked around the sail, examining the damage from all angles. She ran her rough hands over the thick, stiff canvas. This was a material she understood. It was just a heavier, tougher version of the wools and linens in her shop. The principles were the same. She asked for the tools she would need: a strong needle, a waxed linen thread, and a sailor's palm, a leather strap with a metal thimble that was used to push needles through tough material. The men watched her, their expressions a mixture of hope and skepticism. What could this small, quiet girl do that they could not? Vera knelt on the cold ground beside the sail. She trimmed the ragged edges of the tier, making a clean, straight line. Then she began to sew. Her hands, which had felt so clumsy with the carding paddles, were now in their element. They moved with a speed and a precision that was mesmerizing to watch. She used a special kind of stitch, a herringbone stitch that was both strong and flexible. Her needle rose and fell in a perfect hypnotic rhythm. The men watched in silence, their skepticism turning to awe. They had never seen anyone sew like this. Her stitches were not just functional. They were beautiful, a perfect, symmetrical pattern that drew the two sides of the tear together seamlessly. She worked for hours, her focus absolute. The world outside the shed disappeared. There was only the canvas, the needle, and the thread. When she was finished, the long, jagged tier was gone. In its place was a seam so strong and so neat that it looked like it had always been a part of the sail. She had not just patched the sail, she had rewoven it, making it stronger than it was before. The fisherman, his face full of gratitude and amazement, offered her payment. Vera gently refused. She had not done it for money. She had done it because it was a skill she had, and it was needed. That evening, the feeling in the village was different. When she walked back to her hut, people smiled at her. They nodded their heads in a gesture of respect. She was no longer just the outsider who did menial work. She was Vera, the tailor, a person with a valuable and respected skill. She had earned her place, not with the strength of her back, but with the skill of her hands. The next day, when she went to Sorcha's house, there was a change. Sorcha looked at her, and for the first time, Vera saw a glimmer of a smile in the old woman's piercing blue eyes. It was a small, fleeting thing, but it was there. Sorcha did not say anything about the sale. She did not need to. She simply pointed to the spinning wheel. It was time for the next lesson. Sorcha sat at the wheel and began to spin. Her foot pressed the treadle in a steady, rhythmic beat. Her hands worked in a fluid, coordinated dance. With one hand, she gently drew out the fibers from a row log. With the other, she controlled the twist that the spinning wheel was feeding into the fibers. The thread seemed to flow from her fingers, a thin, even strand that was wound onto the bobbin. It looked effortless. It looked like magic. Then, it was Vera's turn. She sat at the wheel, her body stiff and awkward. The simple act of coordinating her foot and her hands felt impossibly complex. When she pressed the treadle too fast, the thread would snap. When she pressed it too slowly, the wheel would stop. When she drew out too many fibers, the thread would be thick and lumpy. When she drew out too few, it would be weak and thin. Her first attempts were a disaster. She produced a series of broken, lumpy, and uneven threads that were good for nothing. The frustration was immense. It was so much harder than it looked. Sorcha was a patient, silent teacher. She would let Vera struggle, let her fail. Then she would gently place her own gnarled hands over Vera's. She would not speak. She would simply guide Vera's hands, letting her feel the correct tension, the right amount of draft. She would guide Vera's foot on the treadle, establishing the steady, waltz-like rhythm. Vera learned that spinning was not about seeing. It was about feeling. It was a conversation between the spinner's hands and the wool. She had to learn to listen to the fibers, to feel how much they wanted to be stretched, how much twist they needed to hold together. Days turned into weeks. Vera spent her days in Sorcha's small, warm house, the rhythmic hum of the spinning wheel a constant sound. Her mornings were still filled with chores, but they were lighter now. The other women would sometimes help her carry the water. The men would nod to her with respect. She was part of the village now, in a way she had never expected. She was still an outsider, but she was a valued outsider. She was the quiet tailor who had mended their sail and was now learning their most ancient craft. As they worked together in the quiet companionship of the craft, Sorcha finally began to talk. The words came slowly at first, in short, clipped sentences. She would tell Vera about the different breeds of sheep, about the way the weather affected the quality of the wool. She talked about the plants that were used for dyeing, the bright yellow from the gorse flowers, the deep red from the lichen on the rocks, the soft green from the heather. But as the days went on, her stories became more personal. She began to speak of the past. She spoke of her childhood on the island, a life that was both hard and beautiful. And one afternoon, as the light was beginning to fade, she finally spoke about her brother. Her voice was low and heavy with a sadness that was decades old. She told Vera about a bright, ambitious boy who had always dreamed of the world beyond the cliffs. A boy who had chafed at the island's isolation and its poverty. A boy who had loved the stories of the sailors who passed through, their tales of faraway cities and a life of ease and wealth. She spoke of the day he had left. He had not said a proper goodbye. He had just disappeared in the night, catching a ride on a passing merchant ship. He had left a short note for his family, promising to return one day, a rich and successful man. He had broken his mother's heart. His father had never spoken his name again. Sorcia, his younger sister, had been left with a confusing mix of anger and grief. She was angry at him for abandoning them, for being ashamed of their life, and she was heartbroken because she had lost the brother she adored. As she spoke, Vera listened in stunned silence. The bright, ambitious boy in Sorcia's story was the same sad, longing young man from the journal. It was Elias. The realization hit Vera with the force of a physical blow. Sorcia was his sister. This was his home. He had never returned. He had never made peace with his family. He had died an old man, full of a secret regret. Vera looked at the old woman sitting across from her, her face etched with a lifetime of unresolved sorrow. She finally understood. The cloak was not just a project. It was not just a bridge between his two lives. It was his apology. It was the letter home he had never been able to write. It was his way of finally saying he was sorry, of showing them that he had never truly forgotten them. He had woven his love for his home into the intricate embroidery of the lining, and he had planned to finish it with a thread that represented the very soul of the island. Vera felt a profound sadness for them both, for the brother who had died alone with his regret, and for the sister who had lived her entire life with a wall of anger around her broken heart. She did not say anything. There were no words she could offer that would heal a wound that old. She simply reached out her hand and for a brief moment rested it on Sorcia's arm. It was a small gesture of shared grief, of understanding. Sorcia did not pull away. She just nodded, a single silent tear tracing a path through the deep wrinkles on her cheek. The long, silent story was finally out in the open. The secret that had been locked in a cedar chest hundreds of miles away had finally found its way home. And in that moment, in that small, warm room, with the sound of the wind and the sea outside, a small, fragile thread of healing began to be spun. Chapter 6. Spinning the Light. The revelation of Sorcia's past, of her connection to Elias, changed everything. The air in the small stone house was different now. The silence between the two women was no longer the silence of suspicion or of a teacher and an apprentice. It was a shared silence, heavy with the weight of a long and sad family story. Sorcia's anger, the hard shell she had carried for a lifetime, had been cracked open. In its place was a quiet, deep-seated grief that was now, for the first time, allowed to breathe. She did not speak of Elias again for several days. But the story hung in the air between them, a silent and constant presence. Vera now understood the flicker of pain she had seen in Sorcia's eyes on that first day when she had shown her the cloak. Sorcia had recognized her brother's work immediately. Her hostility had not been directed at Vera, the stranger. It had been directed at the ghost of the brother who had abandoned her, who had sent a stranger to finish a task he should have completed himself. Vera's purpose on the island was now clearer and heavier. She was not just finishing a garment. She was mending a family. She was stitching together the torn edges of a brother and sister's story, separated by a lifetime of silence and an ocean of regret. Her work at the spinning wheel took on a new significance. It was no longer just a skill to be mastered. It was a meditation, a way of connecting with the past. As her hands drafted the wool and her foot kept the steady rhythm on the treadle, she would think of Elias, the young boy, watching his mother at a wheel just like this one. She would think of the generations of women who had sat in this very spot, spinning the wool from their sheep, their hands and feet moving in the same timeless dance. She was becoming a part of this long, unbroken thread of history. Her skill grew with each passing day. The lumpy, uneven threads of her first attempts were now a distant memory. She could spin a thread that was fine, strong, and even. Sorcia would take the bobbins of Vera's thread and inspect them, her expert fingers feeling for any inconsistencies. She would give a short, sharp nod of approval, a gesture that Vera now understood as high praise. The baskets in the corner of the room began to fill with bobbins of Vera's perfectly spun yarn. The work was satisfying. It was a tangible result of her patience and her hard-won skill. One morning, after weeks of this steady work, Sorcia decided that Vera was ready. The time for practice was over. It was time to spin the real thread. It was time to understand the secret of the sea's own light. Sorcia did not announce this with any ceremony. She simply took a different kind of fleece from a high shelf. It was wrapped in clean linen, a sign that it was special. She laid it on the table. The wool was different from the fleece Vera had been working with. It was finer, softer, and it seemed to have a faint, silvery sheen to it, even in the dim light of the cottage. Sorcia told Vera that this wool came from a special small flock of sheep, the oldest on the island. These were not the sheep that Vera had herded on the hills. These sheep were kept in a sheltered valley on the far side of the island, a place that was difficult to reach. Sorcia told her to gather her cloak and a small bag. They were going on a journey. They set out at dawn. The air was cold and clear. The sky was a pale, soft pink. They did not walk through the village. They took a narrow, winding path that led up into the rugged hills behind the houses. The climb was steep, and the path was little more than a goat track. Vera, who had once struggled to carry a bucket of water, now climbed with a steady, sure-footed pace. Her body was strong, her lungs accustomed to the thin, clean air. They walked in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crunch of their feet on the rocky path, the cry of the gulls, and the distant, constant roar of the sea. Sorcia led the way, her small, wiry body moving with an energy that defied her age. She knew this land as well as she knew the lines on her own hand. After an hour of climbing, they reached the top of a high ridge. From here, Vera could see the entire island laid out below her. She saw the small cluster of houses in the village, the gray beach, and the endless glittering expanse of the sea. She could see the sea foam's route, the path that had brought her here from her old life. It all looked so small and so far away. Sorcia did not pause for long. She led Vera down the other side of the ridge into a part of the island Vera had never seen before. It was a landscape of deep shadowed valleys and strange twisted rock formations. The wind was quieter here, sheltered by the high hills. They followed the path downwards into a long, narrow valley. As they descended, the air began to feel different. It was damper, and it carried a strange, new scent, a mix of damp earth, salt, and something else, something faintly sweet and luminous. At the bottom of the valley, they came to a place that felt secret and ancient. It was a series of sea caves, their entrances carved into the base of the cliffs by millennia of waves. The tide was out, revealing a stretch of dark, wet sand littered with tide pools and slick, green seaweed. Sorcia led Vera towards the largest of the caves. Its entrance was a dark, yawning mouth in the rock face. Vera hesitated for a moment. The darkness looked intimidating. Sorcia looked back at her and gave a small nod of encouragement. Vera followed her into the cave. Inside, the air was cool and still. The sound of the sea was a muffled, distant thunder. It was not completely dark. Faint light filtered in from the entrance, and after a moment, Vera's eyes began to adjust. The cave was much larger than it had looked from the outside. Its walls were slick with moisture, and small pools of seawater dotted the sandy floor. But the most amazing thing was the moss. A strange, pale, silvery green moss grew in thick patches all along the damp walls of the cave, just above the high tide line. And it was glowing. It was not a bright light, but a soft, gentle, ethereal luminescence, like captured moonlight. It pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, like a sleeping heartbeat. The entire cave was filled with this cool, quiet light. It was one of the most beautiful and mysterious things Vera had ever seen. Sorcia watched Vera's face, seeing the wonder in her eyes. She explained that this was the secret of the island. This phosphorescent moss grew only in these caves, nourished by the salt spray and the unique minerals in the rock. The special flock of sheep, the ones whose wool was so prized, were brought here to graze. They loved the moss, they ate it, and something in the moss was absorbed into their bodies, into their wool. It did not make the wool itself glow, but it gave the fibers a unique, silvery quality, a structure that caught and reflected light in a way that no other wool could. This was the source of the sea's own light. It was not magic. It was nature. It was the deep, quiet alchemy of the land and the sea. They did not stay in the cave for long. Sorcia explained that the sheep only came at certain times when the tide and the light were just right. This journey was for Vera to understand the source, to see where the thread was born. The walk back to the village was quiet. Vera's mind was full of what she had seen. The glowing cave felt like a sacred place. The thread she was about to spin was not just a thread. It was made of starlight and seawater, of ancient rock and patient, growing things. It was the island's soul, spun into a physical form. The next morning, the final stage of her education began. Sorcha laid the special silvery fleece out on a clean cloth. The process was the same as before, but now every step was performed with a new level of reverence and care. The washing, the carding, every movement was deliberate and focused. Vera's hands, now strong and skilled, worked with a new sense of purpose. She was not just cleaning wool, she was preparing a sacred material. When the wool was carded into light, airy rolags, Sorcha finally allowed Vera to spin the special fleece. Vera sat at the spinning wheel, her heart beating with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She took the first rolag, its fibers seeming to shimmer with a faint, internal light. She took a deep breath and began to press the treadle. The wheel began to turn. Her hands began their familiar dance. She drafted the fibers, her fingers feeling the soft, silky texture. The wool behaved differently from the normal fleece. It was smoother, finer, and it seemed to want to spin itself. The thread that flowed from her fingers was the most beautiful she had ever created. It was incredibly fine, almost like a spider's silk, but it was strong and perfectly even, and it had the most amazing luster. In the firelight of the cottage, it seemed to capture the light and hold it, glowing with a soft, silvery sheen. It was not a magical glow. It was a natural radiance, a trick of light on the unique structure of the fibers, but it looked like magic. It looked like a thread spun from pure moonlight. Vera spun for the rest of the day, her focus absolute. She was no longer just an apprentice learning a craft. She was a creator, participating in the island's oldest and most sacred art. She was spinning the light of the sea. As she worked, Sorcha sat nearby, her own hands finally still. She watched Vera, and she began to tell the end of her story. She spoke of the years after Elias had left. She spoke of the long silence, the absence of any letters. She spoke of how her parents had grown old and passed away, their hearts still heavy with the loss of their son. She spoke of her own life, of how she had stayed on the island, had become its elder, the keeper of its traditions, its weaver. She had married a fisherman, had children and grandchildren. She had lived a full, hard, and good life. But the space her brother had left had never been filled. The anger she had felt had been a shield, a way to protect her heart from the pain of his abandonment. She told Vera that when she had first arrived, a stranger from the town, wearing a cloak made with his unmistakable skill, all that old anger and pain had come rushing back. She had seen Vera as an extension of his betrayal. But as she had watched Vera work, as she had seen her quiet strength, her stubborn persistence, her deep respect for the craft, her feelings had begun to change. She saw that Vera was not like him. Vera had not come to take something from the island. She had come to give something back. She had come to finish a story. Vera continued to spin, the wheel's gentle hum a soft accompaniment to Sorcha's words. She spun all the bobbins of her normal practice thread into a single, large skein. Then she spun the precious, silvery wool, creating a smaller, more delicate skein that shone in the dim light. The physical work was done. She had the thread. She had earned it through her labor, her patience, and her willingness to understand. Now, the final, most difficult work remained. She had to finish the cloak. She had to take her master's work, the craft of the island, and her own newfound voice as an artist, and weave them together. The next morning, Vera retrieved the cloak from her hut. She had kept it carefully wrapped in linen. She brought it to Sorcia's house and unrolled it on the large wooden table. In the weeks she had been on the island, she had almost forgotten how beautiful it was. The dark, heavy wool, the twilight blue silk lining, the intricate embroidery of the ocean currents. It was a masterpiece of technical skill. But it was also a sad object. It was a story without an ending. It was a message that had never been delivered. She laid her 2 skeins of thread beside it, the plain, strong thread she had practiced with, and the shining, silvery thread she had just spun. She knew what she had to do. The note from Elias had said the silvery thread was for the final, most important part. But as she looked at the cloak, she realized that the most important part was not just a decorative edge. The most important part was telling the whole story. She took a needle and threaded it with the plain, strong wool she had spun first. This was the thread of her own journey, of her hard work and her transformation. She began to sew, not on the collar or the cuffs, but on the inside, on the beautiful silk lining. She did not follow a pattern. She let her hands and her heart guide her. She began to add her own embroidery to Elias's. His work was a swirling, abstract pattern of ocean currents. Hers was different. Her stitches were small and figurative. She began to stitch the story of the island into the lining of the cloak. She stitched the shape of the rugged cliffs. She stitched the small stone houses of the village. She stitched the hardy, intelligent faces of the island sheep. She stitched the glowing moss in the sea cave. She stitched the spinning wheel and the loom. Her stitches were not as technically perfect as Elias's. They had a simpler, more rustic quality, but they were full of feeling. They were full of her experiences, her respect for the island and its people. She was adding her own chapter to his story. She was weaving her own voice into the fabric of his legacy. Sorcia watched her work, her expression a mixture of surprise and profound understanding. She saw what Vera was doing. She was not just completing a task. She was creating a bridge between the brother who had left and the sister who had stayed. She was stitching their 2 worlds together. Vera worked for several days, her needle flying over the silk. The inside of the cloak became a tapestry, a secret map of the island's soul. When she was finished with her own story, she finally took up the silvery thread. This was Elias's thread, the thread of his home, the thread he had dreamed of. She threaded her needle with its shining light. As his note had instructed, she used it for the final, most important part. She began to embroider the collar and the cuffs. She did not use a complex pattern. She used a simple, ancient stitch, one she had seen in the old weavings in Sorcia's house. It was a stitch that looked like a wave, a repeating, endless pattern of the sea. The silvery thread stood out against the dark, stormy wool of the cloak. It caught the light, shimmering and glowing with every movement. It was like a line of sea foam breaking on a dark shore. It was the final touch, the perfect, luminous period at the end of a long and complicated sentence. When the last stitch was in place, she snipped the thread and knotted it. It was done. The cloak was finished. She held it up. It was no longer just Elias's cloak. It was not just her work. It was a collaboration across time and death. It was a story of a brother's regret and a sister's forgiveness. It was a story of a young woman who had left home to find a thread, and in doing so, had found herself. She turned and held the cloak out to Sorcia. She did not say a word. She did not need to. The cloak said everything. Sorcia reached out a trembling, gnarled hand. She did not take the cloak. She gently touched the silvery embroidery on the collar. She traced the simple, wave-like pattern with her finger. Then, her hand moved to the inside of the cloak, to the lining. Her fingers brushed over the small, stitched shapes of the sheep, the cliffs, the tiny stone houses. A lifetime of guarded emotion finally broke. Her stern face crumpled, and the silent tears she had held back for so long finally fell. She was not just mourning the brother she had lost. She was grieving for the years of silence, for the misunderstanding, for the apology that had arrived a lifetime too late, but had arrived all the same. Vera stood silently, letting the old woman grieve. The cloak was not a magical object. It could not turn back time. It could not erase the pain. But it was a tangible symbol of forgiveness. It was a message, finally delivered. And in the small, quiet house, with the sound of the wind and the sea, it was enough. Chapter 7. The Last Seam. The completion of the cloak marked the end of Vera's purpose on the island. But the air in Sorcia's cottage did not feel like an ending. It felt like a quiet, peaceful beginning. Sorcia's tears, when they finally came, were not a storm of grief, but a gentle, cleansing rain. She held the finished cloak in her hands, her fingers tracing the story stitched into its fabric. She felt the weight of the dark wool, the smoothness of the silk lining, and the almost living quality of the silvery thread. It was more than a garment. It was a conversation, a history, a peace offering. For the first time, she could see her brother not as the boy who had abandoned his family, but as the man who had never forgotten them. And she saw Vera, the quiet girl from the town, as the messenger who had bravely carried that apology across the water. The days that followed were different. The intense focus of the work was gone, replaced by a soft, comfortable quiet. Vera did not go back to her cold, damp hut. Sorcia insisted she stay in the main house, in a small, warm room that had once belonged to her own children. The island had ceased to be a place of trial and had become, unexpectedly, a place of belonging. Vera did not spend her days in idle rest. The habits of work were now deeply ingrained in her. She helped Sorcia with the daily tasks of the household, but now she was not an outsider performing chores. She was a participant, a member of the family. She would fetch the water from the well, her arms now strong enough to carry the full bucket without spilling. She would help in the small garden. Her hands, though still calloused, now knew how to pull weeds and tend to the hardy vegetables. She would sit with Sorcia in the evenings, not as a student, but as a companion. Sometimes they would work in comfortable silence. Sorcia at her loom, Vera mending a piece of clothing for one of the villagers. Other times, Sorcia would tell her stories. She told her about the history of the island, about the shipwrecks and the hard winters, about the festivals and the traditions. She spoke of her own life, her husband who had been lost at sea many years ago, her children who had grown up and moved to the mainland in search of easier lives. Vera was a quiet and patient listener. She was learning the fabric of this community, the threads of joy and sorrow that wove all their lives together. Vera, in turn, began to share pieces of her own story. She spoke of her life as an orphan, of the quiet, gentle man who had taken her in and taught her his trade. She described the little tailor shop in Saltwind, the comforting rhythm of the work, the smell of the hot iron on damp cloth. She spoke of her fear, her lack of confidence, her inability to create anything of her own. She told Sorcia how she had only ever been able to copy Elias's patterns, how the thought of designing something new had filled her with a paralyzing terror. Sorcia listened, her pale blue eyes full of a deep, ancient wisdom. She did not offer easy words of comfort. She simply told Vera that a person's hands can only create what their heart understands. She said that Vera's heart had been quiet and fearful, so her hands had been quiet and obedient. But now, Sorcia said, Vera's heart had seen the wildness of the sea and the strength of the stone. It had felt the cold wind and the warmth of the fire. It had known loneliness, and it had found community. Her heart had grown, and now her hands would have new stories to tell. The cloak lay on the cedar chest in Vera's new room. It was a finished object, a perfect and complete work of art. But it also felt like a beginning. It was the first thing Vera had ever created that was truly her own. She had taken her master's design and infused it with her own experience, her own voice. The new patterns she had stitched into the lining, the story of the island, were a part of her now. They were not copied from a book or a pattern. They had come from inside her. One afternoon, one of the village women came to Sorcia's house with a small bundle of hand-spun yarn. It was a beautiful, soft gray, the color of the sea on a misty morning. She had spun it for her daughter, who was getting married. She wanted to knit her a special shawl, but she wanted it to be unique. She had seen Vera's beautiful, tiny stitches. She shyly asked if Vera could embroider a small pattern along the edge of the shawl after it was knitted. She did not have a pattern in mind. She just wanted something beautiful, something that spoke of the island. Vera looked at the soft gray yarn. An image immediately came into her mind, not from a book, but from her own memory. She saw the delicate, branching patterns of the seaweed in the tide pools. She saw the swirling shapes of the seabirds as they rode the wind. Without hesitation, she took a piece of charcoal and a smooth, flat stone. She began to sketch. The lines flowed from her hand, no longer timid and fearful, but confident and sure. She sketched a beautiful, flowing border design that wove the shapes of the birds and the seaweed into an elegant, repeating pattern. The woman looked at the sketch, her eyes wide with wonder. It was perfect. It was the island, captured in a few simple, beautiful lines. It was a design born not of fear, but of understanding. Vera spent the next few weeks working on small projects for the villagers. She mended their clothes, not just with strength, but with artistry. She would take a simple patch and turn it into a decorative element, a small embroidered leaf or a bird. She taught the children how to do simple stitches, their clumsy fingers learning a new kind of magic. She was no longer just the tailor. She was the island's artist. She felt a sense of purpose and belonging that she had never known in her life. The quiet, lonely girl who had been afraid of a bolt of silk was gone. In her place was a confident young woman who could create beauty with her own two hands. The time passed in a peaceful, productive haze. The harshness of the island's autumn began to soften into the deeper cold of winter. The days grew shorter, the nights longer. Vera knew she could not stay on the island forever. The sign on her shop door in Saltwind promised she would return. But the thought of leaving this place, this community that had become her home, was a painful one. One morning, the familiar shape of a ship appeared on the horizon. It was the sea foam, returning from its journey to the northern towns. Captain Reese had kept his word. The sight of the ship was a bittersweet reminder. It was her connection to the outside world, her way home. But it was also a signal that her time on the Isle of Skye was coming to an end. The ship anchored in the small sheltered cove, and a small boat was rowed to the shore. Finn was in it. His friendly, open face was a welcome sight. He looked surprised and pleased to see her. He had not been sure if she would still be here. He saw the change in her immediately. The pale, timid girl who had huddled in her cloak on the journey north was gone. This Vera stood tall and confident. Her face was weathered by the wind and the sun, and her hands were rough, but her eyes were bright and clear. She was no longer a visitor. She looked like she belonged here. He told her they would be staying for 2 days before beginning the long journey back to Saltwind. The choice was hers. That evening, Vera sat with Sorsha by the fire. The time for her departure was real now. She had to make a decision. A part of her wanted to stay. She could live here, in this small, strong community. She could become the island's weaver, its tailor. She could live a simple, meaningful life, surrounded by the wild beauty of the land and the sea. But another part of her knew that her journey was not over. The Isle of Skye had been a chapter in her story, not the final page. It had been a place of healing and discovery. It had given her a new strength and a new voice. But her own life, the one she had to build for herself, was waiting for her back in Saltwind. She had to take what she had learned here and build something new with it. She looked at Sorsha, her heart full of a love and gratitude that was too deep for words. She told the old woman that she had to go back. Sorsha simply nodded. Her expression was sad, but it was also full of pride. She had known this day would come. She told Vera that this would always be her home. She was no longer an outsider. She was a daughter of the island. The final day was a day of quiet goodbyes. The villagers, who had once been so suspicious, now treated her as one of their own. They came to Sorsha's house, bringing small, handmade gifts. The fisherman whose sail she had mended gave her a beautiful knife with a handle carved from whalebone. The woman whose daughter was getting married gave her a small, soft shawl knitted from the misty gray wool. The children gave her a collection of beautiful shells and sea-smoothed stones. Each gift was a small piece of the island, a tangible memory of her time there. Her last goodbye was with Sorsha. The old woman did not say much. Words were not her way. Instead, she gave Vera 2 gifts. The first was the beautiful hand-carved spinning wheel that Vera had learned on. Sorcia said that a spinner needed her own wheel, and this one knew the touch of Vera's hands. It was an incredibly generous gift, a tool that was both a treasure and a part of the family's history. The second gift was smaller. It was a single beautiful spindle carved from a dark, smooth piece of wood that had washed up on the shore. Sorcia told her it was a drop spindle, the kind their ancestors had used before the wheel. It was a simple, ancient tool, a reminder of the deep roots of the craft. Sorcia told her to use it to remember that all great and complex things begin with a simple, patient twist of the hand. Finally, she took the finished cloak. It was the reason she had come, and it was the thing she had to leave behind. She held it out to Sorcia. She said that it belonged here. It was Elias's apology, and its home was with his sister. Sorcia looked at the cloak, then back at Vera. She shook her head. She said that Elias had made the cloak for a journey. Its journey was not over. She told Vera that the cloak belonged to her now. It had been her master's legacy, but now it was her masterpiece. It held the story of her own journey, her own transformation. It was a part of Vera now, and she had to take it with her. Vera looked at the cloak, at the stories stitched into its fabric. She understood. Sorcia was right. The cloak was a bridge, not an anchor. It was meant to travel. It was a reminder of where she had come from and a symbol of who she had become. Finn came to the door to tell her it was time to leave. Vera put on the magnificent cloak. It felt different now. It was no longer just heavy. It felt full of strength, of history, of love. She gathered her few possessions, the spinning wheel, the spindle, the small gifts from the villagers. With Finn's help, she carried them down to the beach. The entire village had come out to see her off. They did not wave or shout. They just stood in a quiet, respectful line, a silent testament to the place she had earned in their hearts. Sorcia stood at the front, her small frame straight and proud against the wild gray landscape. Vera looked at the old woman, her surrogate mother, her stern and wise teacher. No words were exchanged. A simple, deep look of understanding and love passed between them. It was a goodbye that would last a lifetime. Vera got into the small boat. As Finn rowed her towards the sea foam, she did not look back. She kept her eyes on the horizon, on the open sea that lay ahead. The Isle of Skye had given her more than just a thread. It had given her a new life, and now it was time to go and live it. The journey back to Saltwind was a world away from her first voyage. Vera did not hide in the corner of the deck, sick and afraid. She stood at the railing, the wind in her hair, the heavy cloak warm on her shoulders. She was at home on the sea now. The rise and fall of the ship felt like a familiar cradle. The sailors who had seen her leave as a timid girl now saw a confident woman. They treated her with a new respect. Finn was a constant, friendly presence. The shy, hesitant conversations of their first journey were replaced by easy, comfortable talk. Vera, who had once been so quiet, now had stories to tell. She told him about the island, about the hard work and the kind people. She told him about Sorsha and about the craft of spinning. She even showed him the silvery thread, and he marveled at its strange, beautiful light. She did not tell him the whole story of Elias and his family. That was a private, sacred story. But she shared the parts of her journey that were her own. Finn, in turn, told her about his own life. He was an orphan, like her, and the sea had been his only home for as long as he could remember. He dreamed of one day owning his own small ship, of being his own captain. They were two lonely people who had found a point of connection in the vast, empty space of the ocean. A quiet, gentle friendship bloomed between them, born of shared stories and mutual respect. As they sailed south, the air grew warmer, the sea a friendlier shade of blue. One morning, the familiar coastline of Saltwind appeared on the horizon. The sight of the town's tall, thin spire filled Vera with a strange mix of emotions. It was home, but she was a different person now. She was not the same girl who had left this port months ago. She wondered if she would still fit in this small, familiar world. The sea foam sailed into the harbor and docked at the same busy wharf she had departed from. The noise, the smells, the chaos, which had once been so intimidating, now just seemed vibrant and full of life. Captain Reese helped her with her spinning wheel. He wished her well, a kind and genuine smile on his weathered face. Finn carried her bag for her, walking with her off the ship and onto the solid ground of Saltwind. He walked with her through the familiar cobblestone streets. The town looked exactly the same, but Vera saw it with new eyes. She saw the colors, the textures, the small details she had never noticed before. The world seemed brighter, more full of possibility. They arrived at the closed door of the tailor shop. The small white sign was still there. Closed for a time. I will be back soon. Vera took a deep breath. She had kept her promise. Finn set her bag and the spinning wheel down on the step. He did not leave right away. There was a moment of awkward silence. He told her he was glad she had found what she was looking for. Vera thanked him for everything, for his kindness, for his stories. He gave her a small, shy smile and said he hoped he would see her again. Then he turned and walked back towards the sea, his home. Vera watched him go, then turned to face the door of the shop. She took the old iron key from her pocket. It felt cool and solid in her hand. She put the key in the lock, turned it, and pushed the door open. She was home. Chapter 8. The Tailor of Saltwind. Stepping back into the tailor shop was like stepping into a memory. The air inside was still and thick with the scent of old fabric and cold dust. A thin, gray film covered every surface, a blanket of time that had settled during her long absence. The bolts of wool and linen on the shelves stood like silent, patient soldiers, waiting for a command that had never come. The sewing machines were quiet under their canvas covers. The large cutting table was an empty, barren landscape. For a moment, the heavy silence of her grief returned, a ghostly echo of the lonely days after Elias had passed away. But it was different this time. The silence did not feel like an ending. It felt like a pause. It was a space, waiting to be filled. Vera stood in the doorway, the magnificent cloak still on her shoulders, her spinning wheel at her side. She was no longer a frightened girl lost in an empty room. She was a traveler who had returned with new tools, new skills, and a new story to tell. She did not feel overwhelmed. She felt a quiet, steady sense of purpose. This was her shop now, not just by inheritance, but by choice. It was her canvas. She spent the first few days not sewing, but cleaning. It was a ritual of reclamation. She opened all the windows, letting the fresh, salty air of salt wind chase away the stale, stagnant atmosphere. Sunlight poured into the dusty room, illuminating the work that needed to be done. She swept the floors, her broom moving with a strong, steady rhythm. She wiped down the shelves, taking down each bolt of fabric, unrolling it slightly to let it breathe, and then placing it back with care. She uncovered the sewing machines and meticulously cleaned and oiled every moving part, her hands moving with a new confidence. She polished the old wood of the cutting table until it shone with a soft, warm glow. This was not a sad, lonely task. It was an act of love, of respect for the man who had built this place, and an act of preparation for the future she was about to build within its walls. She placed her new spinning wheel in a place of honor near the window, its dark, carved wood, a beautiful contrast to the familiar tools of the shop. It was a symbol of her journey, a bridge between her old life and her new one. When the shop was clean, when it was bright and full of fresh air and light, she finally sat down to work. But she did not take on a simple mending job. She did not wait for a customer to bring her a torn seam or a missing button. She walked to the high shelf where the most beautiful and expensive fabrics were kept. Her eyes found the bolt of blue silk, the one Elias had shown her so long ago, the one she had been too afraid to touch. She took it down from the shelf. The silk was cool and smooth in her rough, calloused hands. The color was as clear and bright as the sky on a perfect summer day. She remembered the fear she had felt, the paralyzing terror of making a mistake, of ruining something so perfect. She smiled a small, sad smile for the girl she had been. The fear was gone. She was not afraid of the silk anymore. It was not a perfect, untouchable object. It was a material full of possibility. It was a blank page waiting for a story. She did not use one of Elias's old patterns. She put them away, respectfully, in a drawer. She took out a fresh sheet of large brown paper and a piece of charcoal. She stood before the paper for a long moment, not in fear, but in thought. She closed her eyes. She thought of the journey she had taken. She thought of the vast, open sea, the endless horizon. She thought of the rugged cliffs of the Isle of Skye, the way they rose from the water, strong and uncompromising. She thought of the delicate, glowing moss in the sea cave. She thought of the swirling flight of the gulls on the wind. An idea began to form in her mind, not a copy of something she had seen, but a new shape, a new feeling. She began to sketch. Her hand moved with a confidence that felt utterly new. She was not drawing a fashionable dress from a magazine. She was drawing a feeling. She designed a dress with a simple, elegant cut that flowed like water. The sleeves were long and graceful, like the wings of a seabird. The neckline was high and simple, like the clean line of the horizon. It was a design that was both elegant and wild, sophisticated and natural. It was the story of her journey, translated into the language of fabric and thread. When the sketch was done, she took the shears. They felt balanced and powerful in her hand. She laid the beautiful blue silk out on the cutting table. She took a deep breath, and she made the first cut. The sound of the sharp blades slicing through the perfect fabric was not a sound of destruction. It was a sound of creation. It was the beginning of something new. She worked on the dress for several days, her focus absolute. The hum of the sewing machine once again filled the shop, but it was a different sound now. It was not the sound of an apprentice following instructions. It was the sound of an artist at work. She sewed the seams with all the precision Elias had taught her, but she added her own touches. She used a special, almost invisible stitch for the hems, a technique she had developed herself. The dress took shape, a beautiful flowing garment that seemed to capture the very essence of the sea and the sky. But it was not yet finished. She took out the small, precious skein of silvery thread she had spun on the island, the thread spun from the sea's own light. With this thread, she began to embroider. She did not stitch the story of the island into this dress. This was a different story. This was the story of her own new beginning. She embroidered a delicate, abstract pattern around the neckline and the cuffs, a pattern that hinted at the shape of a breaking wave, of sunlight on water. The silvery thread shimmered against the deep blue of the silk. It was a touch of magic, a whisper of the secret places she had been. When the dress was finished, she did not hang it in the back of the shop to wait for a customer. She created a display in the front window. She cleared away the old, dusty collection of pincushions and thread spools. She draped a simple piece of gray linen, the color of the island's stone, as a backdrop. And in the center of the window, she placed the blue silk dress on a tailor's dummy. It was the only thing in the window. It was a single, perfect statement, a work of art. The dress in the window caused a stir in the quiet town of Saltwind. People who had walked past the dusty tailor shop for years without a second glance now stopped to look. They had never seen anything like it. The dress was not like the fussy, fashionable clothes worn by the wealthy merchants' wives. It was something else entirely. It was simple, elegant, and it seemed to be alive with a light of its own. It spoke of the sea, of the wind, of a world beyond the cobblestone streets of the town. People began to talk. They spoke of the quiet apprentice, Vera, who had gone away and come back changed. They spoke of the beautiful, strange dress in the window of the old shop. Her first customer was the wealthy merchant's wife, the one who had wanted the green velvet dress. She came into the shop, her eyes wide with curiosity. She had seen the blue dress in the window. She wanted one just like it. Vera greeted her with a quiet, calm confidence. She explained that the blue dress was a unique creation, but that she could design something special just for her. The woman, intrigued, agreed. Vera did not take out a pattern book. She talked to the woman. She asked her about her life, about her favorite colors, about the things that made her happy. Then she began to sketch. She designed a dress for this woman that was not a copy of the blue one. It was inspired by the woman's own story. It was a dress in a deep, forest green velvet with a design that was inspired by the graceful shapes of ferns and the dappled light of the woods. It was a dress that was uniquely hers. The woman was enchanted. Vera had not just sold her a dress. She had listened to her, and she had created something that was a reflection of her own spirit. This was the beginning of Vera's new life as the tailor of Saltwind. Word of her unique talent spread quickly through the town and beyond. Customers came not just for her skill with a needle, but for her vision. She created clothes that were more than just garments. They were stories. For a young woman who was getting married, she designed a wedding dress embroidered with the delicate patterns of frost on a window pane. For an old sea captain, she made a coat lined with a map of the stars he had sailed under his whole life. Her work was a blend of the two worlds she now inhabited. It had the technical perfection and the sophisticated elegance that Elias had taught her. But it also had the rustic, natural beauty and the deep storytelling soul of the Isle of Skye. She would sit at her spinning wheel by the shop window, the rhythmic motion a calming presence in her busy days. She would spin the local wool, but she would spin it with the skill and the feeling she had learned from Sorcha. Her shop was no longer a quiet, dusty place of mending. It was a bright, vibrant studio full of light, color, and creativity. It was a place where people came not just to have their clothes fixed, but to find a piece of themselves in the fabric and the thread. She became successful. More successful than Elias had ever been. She was able to hire a young apprentice of her own, a bright-eyed girl who was eager to learn. Vera was a patient and kind teacher, just as Elias had been. But she also encouraged her apprentice to find her own voice, to sketch her own ideas, to be brave. She was passing on not just the craft, but the courage she had fought so hard to find. She never forgot the Isle of Skye. The gifts from the villagers were displayed in her small apartment above the shop. The carved bird, the soft gray shawl, the beautiful shells. They were her treasures, reminders of the journey that had changed her life. She would often use the simple drop spindle that Sorcha had given her, the ancient, humble tool, a connection to the deep roots of her craft. And in a special cedar-lined box, she kept the small skein of the silvery thread, a private, precious reminder of the sea's own light. One afternoon, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway of her busy shop. It was Finn. His ship was back in port. He looked around the bright, bustling shop, at the beautiful garments on display, at Vera standing in the center of it all, confident and in command. A wide, proud smile spread across his face. He had come to see how she was, and he had found her not just surviving, but thriving. Their friendship, which had begun on the open sea, continued on the solid ground of Saltwind. Whenever his ship was in port, he would visit her. He would bring her small gifts from the faraway places he had been. A strange shell, a piece of colored glass, a pressed flower. She would welcome him with a warm smile and a cup of tea. They would sit and talk for hours, two orphans who had found a sense of family in each other. He would tell her of his adventures on the sea, and she would tell him of her small adventures in thread and fabric. The story ends not on a grand, dramatic note, but on a quiet, perfect afternoon. Vera is in her shop. The late afternoon sun streams through the window, illuminating the space. The shop is full of the gentle sounds of her work, the snip of scissors, the hum of the sewing machine, the quiet chatter of her apprentice. Finn is there, sitting in a chair by the window, telling her a story about a recent storm. Vera is at her cutting table, a piece of beautiful deep red wool spread out before her. She is sketching a new design, her hand moving with a fluid, joyful confidence. She is wearing a simple, elegant dress of her own design. And over the back of her chair, a silent, watchful guardian hangs the magnificent cloak. Its dark wool absorbs the light, but the silvery thread on its collar and cuffs catches the sun, shining with a soft, gentle glow. Vera is no longer the lonely, frightened apprentice. She is a master of her craft, a respected artist, a friend, a teacher. She is the tailor of Saltwind. She did not just find a rare thread on her journey. She found her own strength, her own voice, her own creative soul. She had taken the threads of her past, the grief and the fear, the love and the legacy, and she had woven them into a new and beautiful life, a life of her own making.